He had spent 7 years keeping the lights on for hospitals across Colorado. 7 years of late nights, missed dinners, and problems only one man could solve. And in less than 60 seconds, a 30-year-old billionaire destroyed all of it with 5 words. Without this job, you're nothing. She expected him to beg. She expected fear to do what money never had to. Instead, this quiet single father reached into his jacket, set his badge on the conference table, and walked out into a thunderstorm straight into the hands of the woman who would ruin her. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who held power over you, stay with me. This story is going to hit differently. Before we go any further, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because the stories on this channel don't stop at one episode. Every week we bring you stories of ordinary people who refused to stay down, and trust me, you don't want to miss a single one. Drop a like if you believe that quiet people can change everything. And leave a comment below telling me what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. Let's get into it. The thunderstorm hit Black Ridge, Colorado, just before 6 in the morning. The polite kind that knocks and waits the kind that kicks the door in. And yes, he'd intervened. Lightning split the sky somewhere over the Rockies, and the thunder that followed rolled through the valley like something that had been waiting a long time to say what it had to say. Rain hammered the streets in thick diagonal sheets, flooding gutters in minutes, turning the downtown intersection into something that looked more like a river than a road. Caleb Hartman drove through it, with his wipers, working as hard as they could and still barely keeping up. He had the radio off. He almost always did on the morning commute, not because he was antisocial, because the 23 minutes between dropping Lily at school and pulling into the Sterling Vector Park garage were the only 23 minutes in his day when nobody needed anything from him. Questions to answer, no systems to diagnose, no emails requiring immediate attention. Just the sound of rain on the roof and his own breathing, and maybe a little time to organize his thoughts before the day dismantled them. This morning, his thoughts were not easy to organize. He had the numbers in his head. He'd had them in his head since 11:30, the previous night when he'd sat at the kitchen table after Lily went to bed, going through the fault simulation results for the 3rd time. He'd hoped the 3rd review would show him something different than the first 2. It hadn't. The synchronization defect in Sterling Vector's emergency relay system was not a theoretical problem. It was a documented, tested, reproducible failure point, and the company was planning to launch the full system to 14 hospital networks across the state in less than 5 days. Caleb had tried twice to schedule a formal meeting with the Technical Oversight Committee. Both times his requests had been redirected to Preston Hale, Sterling Vector's Executive Vice President of Strategic Operations, who had assured him via email, a 3-sentence email, technical acknowledgement whatsoever, that the company's engineering team had reviewed concerns and found the system within acceptable parameters. Caleb had read that email 4 times. He still wasn't sure what acceptable parameters Preston was referring to, because Preston had never once in Caleb's memory sat through a full relay synchronization test. What Preston understood about infrastructure engineering could fit on the back of a business card with room to spare. What Preston understood about corporate presentation, executive optics, and claiming credit for work he didn't do. That required considerably more space. But this was not a normal morning. This morning, Caleb had requested something unusual, a direct seat at the executive leadership meeting, to make noise, not to grandstand. He'd written the request carefully, professionally, the way he did everything, because there was information that the people at the top of this company needed to hear directly, without being filtered through Preston Hale's talent for making uncomfortable truths disappear inside comfortable language. Pat parked in the garage, sat for a moment listening to the rain pounding the concrete above him. Then he picked up the thick engineering folder from the passenger seat, checked his tie in the rearview mirror, not because he cared about ties, because his lip told him he looked official when he wore one, and he liked making her feel proud, and walked toward the elevator. Sterling Vector Energy occupied the top 6 floors of the Hargrove Tower in downtown Black Ridge. The company's offices were the kind of place designed to communicate success before anyone said a word. Polished concrete floors, floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the Rockies, conference rooms named after power grids and infrastructure landmarks. A lobby so aggressively modern, it made some visitors feel like they'd accidentally walked into an architecture magazine. Caleb had worked there for 7 years and still thought the lobby was a bit much. Was not the kind of man who inspired much visual attention in a room like that. Average height, dark hair going gray at the temples earlier than he'd expected. Lily had pointed it out last month, with the cheerful honesty only children manage. He wore the same style of clothes every day, dark slacks, a button-down, a jacket that fit well enough. His face had the particular look of a man who had been tired for several years, but had made a workable peace with it. Unhappy, just worn in. Like good leather. What people noticed, once they worked with him long enough, was his hands. They were always moving, not nervously, but purposefully. He thought with his hands. If he was explaining something complicated, he would sketch invisible diagrams in the air. And somehow this made the complication smaller and the explanation clearer. Engineers trusted those hands. They had a way of finding problems and fixing them that felt less like process and more like instinct. He took the elevator to the executive floor and walked into the conference room exactly on time. 14 people were already seated around the long table. Marketing, legal, finance, operations, all of them in the particular variety of calm that comes right before a meeting nobody is sure about. Caleb set his folder down at the near end of the table, nodded to a couple of engineers he recognized, and took the only remaining chair. He had been in this room before, but not often. His work mostly happened closer to the physical infrastructure field tests, relay stations, emergency response. He was not a man who sought conference rooms. Vivienne Marlowe entered 4 minutes late, which everyone knew was deliberate. She was 30 years old, though the way she moved made her seem older in some ways and younger in others. She had the kind of sharp intelligence that announced itself before she spoke, and the kind of confidence that came from never having been told no by anyone who had the actual power to make it stick. She'd inherited the core of Sterling Vector from her father at 25 and had spent the 5 years since then building it into something significantly larger and considerably more aggressive than what she'd received. She was, by any objective measure, impressive. She was also, by Caleb's direct experience, someone who made decisions on momentum fast, decisive, certain, and treated engineering, caution, the way a race driver treats a suggested speed limit. Technically aware of it. Fundamentally uninterested. She sat at the head of the table, glanced at her phone once, set it face down, and looked around the room with the particular expression that meant the meeting had now started, regardless of what anyone else was doing. "Go," she said. Her assistant, a young woman named Dana who moved through conference rooms like a ghost and seemed to have memorized every agenda item before the meeting began, clicked the presentation forward. "Before we get into the launch sequence review," Caleb said. He didn't raise his hand. He didn't ask permission. He just said it, the way he said most things evenly, without much theater, because what he had to say was enough on its own without theater. The room shifted slightly. Vivienne looked at him with the kind of patience that is not actually patience. "Mr. Hartman," she said, "you're here as a technical consultant for today's meeting, not a scheduled presenter. I'll be brief." She studied him for a moment, then made a small gesture that meant proceed, but understand this is a favor. Caleb opened his folder. He didn't stand up. Standing up felt like performance, and this wasn't a performance. He laid out 3 pages of test results on the table in front of him and turned them so the people nearest him could see. "The emergency relay synchronization in the hospital rollout has a timing defect," he said. "Hypothetically, I ran the failure simulation 12 times over the past 2 weeks. I can provide all 12 datasets. The defect causes a cascade overload in the receiving grid when it activates under high-demand conditions. The specific conditions we're most likely to see during a regional blackout, which is exactly when hospitals will need this system." The room was quiet in a particular way. In plain terms, Caleb continued, if the power goes out across a wide area and those hospitals switch to this emergency system the way it's currently configured, there's a documented probability that the backup networks they're relying on will be overloaded and fail. Patients on life-sustaining equipment are at risk. More quiet. Across the table, Preston Hale, impeccably dressed, silver-haired, The kind of man who seemed professionally pleasant until he was not cleared his throat. Caleb Preston said, with the warm, patient tone of someone explaining something simple to someone slow. I shared your initial concerns with our engineering review team 3 weeks ago. The consensus was that the parameters you flagged fall within the acceptable tolerance range for. What tolerance range? Caleb asked, not aggressively. Just directly. Preston blinked. I'm sorry, which specific tolerance range are you citing? Because I've reviewed every published standard for emergency relay synchronization, NERC-LEE, the Colorado Public Utilities Commission guidelines, and none of them contain a tolerance category that covers this failure point. I'd like to know which standard your engineering review was referencing when they concluded it was acceptable. The silence that followed was not comfortable for anyone, but it was especially uncomfortable for Preston, because Preston did not have an answer to that question. What Preston had was the ability to appear as though he was about to have one, which is a different skill entirely. That detail, Preston said carefully, is something I can follow up on after the meeting. I'd appreciate that, Caleb said. He turned back to Vivienne. I need 96 hours, he said. 4 days. I want to run the full correction protocol, retest the synchronization under simulated blackout conditions, and confirm the fix holds before we connect this system to a single hospital. I'm asking for 4 days. Vivienne had been listening to all of this, with her hands flat on the table and her expression doing very little. This was one of the things people found most unnerving about her. She could hear bad news without letting it reach her face. Whether that was discipline or detachment depended on who you asked. The launch is Monday, she said. I know. 14 hospital networks. $240 million in confirmed contracts. Investor presentations this weekend. Board confidence. Media coverage scheduled for Tuesday morning. She paused. 4 days isn't a small ask, Mr. Hartman. 4 days is what's necessary to be certain we're not sensing a failure into live hospital infrastructure. You're certain there's a problem? Yes. And what's your confidence level on the correction? If I have 96 hours and full access to the relay test environment, high. But I won't know for certain until we run the simulation. Vivienne looked at Preston. Preston gave her a look that communicated, without speaking a word, something along the lines of, this is being blown out of proportion. This is manageable. We have this handled. Vivienne looked back at Caleb. The launch proceeds on Monday, she said. We'll schedule an additional review in the first quarter after deployment. Caleb looked at her for a moment. You want to do the review after we've connected it to hospitals. Our engineering team has signed off. Your engineering team signed off on Preston's summary of my concerns, not on the data itself. Those are different things. He kept his voice level. He was not trying to be combative. He was trying to be precise. I'm asking you to look at the actual simulation results before you make this decision. A summary. The results. Vivienne glanced at the pages on the table in front of him. She did not pick them up. Monday stand, she said. Caleb was quiet for a second. Then I can approve the launch. The temperature in the room dropped about 10 degrees. I'm sorry, Vivienne said. My signature is on the safety certification for this system. I won't certify it for live hospital use until the synchronization defect has been corrected. Don't have the ability to stop you from launching. That's your decision. But I can't put my name on it. Vivienne set her pen down very carefully, the way people set things down when they're deciding how hard they're going to push. Mr. Hartman. Her voice was still smooth, controlled. You have a daughter to think about, correct? Something shifted in the room. Even Preston looked slightly uncomfortable with the direction. Do, Caleb said. A 10-year-old. You're raising her alone. And your salary is... She named a number that was, objectively, a significant amount of money, which covers school fees, your mortgage, insurance, her medical care. She paused. I would think carefully about what it means to be unemployed in that situation. She said it without raising her voice. That was the thing about Vivienne Marlowe. She didn't need to raise her voice. She had trained herself to deliver devastating things in the same register she'd use to discuss quarterly projections. Around the table, 14 executives were doing the collective human thing of making themselves appear not to be listening while listening to every single word. Caleb looked at Vivienne Marlowe, not with anger, not with fear. He looked at her the way he looked at a system that had just revealed its fundamental design flaw. "I have a daughter to think about," he said. "That's exactly right. That's why I won't put my name on something I believe could hurt people in a hospital while the power is out." He paused. "That's not the kind of lesson I want her to watch me learn." Vivian held his gaze. Something moved behind her eyes, not guilt exactly, but something in that neighborhood. Then she said it. "Without this job, you're nothing." She said it quietly, precisely, like a scalpel. The conference room was completely silent. Caleb looked down at the table. He looked at the folder of test results. He'd spent 2 weeks compiling at the 12 simulation data sets, at the documentation that no one at this table was going to read this morning. He reached into his jacket pocket. He set his badge on the table. "I resign," he said. He picked up his folder, pushed his chair back, stood up, buttoned his jacket one button, out of simple habit, and walked out of the conference room without looking back. The hallway outside was quiet, except for the sound of rain hitting the glass exterior of Hargrove Tower, running in long rivers down the windows, and the distant sound of thunder somewhere over the mountains. Caleb took the elevator down without the folder open, without looking at his phone, without talking to anyone. In the lobby, the security guard, an older man named Walt, who'd worked the morning shift for 4 years and knew Caleb by name, looked up from behind the desk. "Rough one?" Walt asked. Caleb considered the question. "Different kind of morning," he said. Walt nodded slowly, the way people nod when they understand that a person doesn't have more words right now, and that's completely reasonable. Caleb walked out through the glass doors and into the storm. The drive home took longer than usual because of the flooding at the downtown intersection, and Caleb sat at a red light for 3 full cycles watching rain pour off the awning of the dry cleaners on the corner in a solid sheet. His hands were on the wheel but not moving. He was not, in that moment, thinking about what he was going to do next. He was not running calculations or assembling a strategy. He was thinking about the look on Preston Hale's face when he couldn't answer the question about tolerance standards. Then underneath that, without quite meaning to, he was thinking about Lily, about dropping her at school this morning, about how she'd said have a good day, Dad, in that distracted way she'd developed lately, the way of someone who is starting to be more interested in her own world than his face. He thought it was slightly sad when he first noticed it, that gradual claiming of interior space. Then a friend had told him it was healthy, that it meant he was doing something right, and he decided to believe that because it made the slight sadness feel like success. He drove home. The house was on the east side of Blackridge, in a neighborhood that had been working class in his father's time, and was now what real estate listings called emerging, which meant the coffee shop on the corner served oat milk and the house 3 doors down had recently sold for what felt like an implausible number. Caleb's house was not implausible. It was a 1970s, 2-story with a porch that needed 2 of its boards. Replaced, he kept meaning to do it on a weekend, and kept not having a free weekend and a backyard that was more ambitious than its current state suggested. He unlocked the front door and stood in the hallway for a moment. The house had the particular quiet of a weekday morning. Lily's backpack was gone from its hook. The breakfast dishes were in the rack he'd loaded before leaving. The photo on the wall near the stairs, him, Lily, and his sister Karen, at the state fair 2 summers ago, all 3 of them sunburned and holding terrible-looking food on sticks, looked exactly as it always did. He went to the kitchen, filled a glass of water, and stood at the counter drinking it. He set the glass in the sink and sat down at the kitchen table, where 12 printed simulation datasets and 3 weeks of his engineering notes were arranged in the same pattern he'd left them at 11:30 last night. He looked at them for a moment. Then he took a long breath. He did not have a plan yet. What he had was, the documentation was correct, the problem was real, and he had done the right thing. The doing the right thing part was not going to pay the mortgage in 60 days, but that was a problem for 60 days from now, and right now it was still morning. His phone sat on the table next to the papers. He had 7 missed calls from Sterling Vector internal numbers, 2 from Dana, 1 from a number he didn't recognize in the executive suite, and 4 from the engineering floor, probably people who'd heard through the building's instant and efficient rumor network that something significant had just happened in the executive conference room. He did not call any of them back. He got up, took the folder from the table, put it in his home filing cabinet, the good one. The fireproof one he'd bought the year after the house had a small kitchen fire that scared him more than he'd admitted, and went upstairs to change out of his meeting clothes. He was going to need to think clearly. Thinking clearly, in his experience, was harder in a tie. Lily came through the front door at 3:27 in the afternoon, which was slightly later than usual. She had an after-school program on Tuesdays, some kind of junior science and engineering workshop that the school had started 2 years ago, and which Lily had initially claimed was nerdy and then spent 6 months enthusiastically attending. She dropped her bag on the hook, called out Dad, the way she always did, not because she thought he might not be there, but because it was a kind of checking in, a small territorial announcement of arrival. Kitchen, he called back. She appeared in the doorway, with her hair escaping from the braid she'd done herself that morning. She'd been doing it herself for 8 months and had developed real competence at it. Today looked like it might have come undone mid-afternoon. She was wearing a jacket that was too big for her, which meant she'd grabbed it without looking. She had a smear of what appeared to be graphite or marker on her right wrist. She looked at him standing at the counter, assembling what was going to be a very modest dinner pasta, because it was the kind of day that needed pasta and required toe performance. "You're home," she said. "I am." Early, a little. She dropped into a kitchen chair, pulled her jacket off, and looked at him with the particular focused attention she'd inherited from someone he was never entirely sure whether it was from him or from her mother. No, but it was one of those things about her that made him catch his breath sometimes. Just a kid sitting in a kitchen chair, paying complete attention. "Did something happen?" she asked. "Yeah," he said. "Something happened." She waited. He put down the wooden spoon. "I decided today that there was a place I no longer should work," he said. "Process this. Were you fired?" "I left." "Why?" He leaned against the counter and looked at her. He thought about how to explain this in a way that was honest without being a burden, because there was a version of this conversation that made a 10-year-old feel responsible for something she had nothing to do. And there was a version that was simply true, was a problem with something the company was about to do, he said. A technical problem that could have hurt people. My boss wanted to move forward anyway. I told her I couldn't approve it. She said some things that I thought were meant to scare me into changing my mind. Did it work? Lily looked at him for a moment. What did she say? He was quiet for a beat. She said that without the job, I was nothing. Lily's face did something complicated. She was 10, which meant she was old enough to understand what that meant as an insult and young enough to be genuinely offended on his behalf in a way that adults had mostly learned to filter. That's not true, she said, firmly. The way she said things when she was absolutely sure. He said, "So what do we do?" He almost smiled. We. It had been just the two of them for 6 years, and somewhere in those 6 years, she had started using we without thinking about it, as though there were no question about whether they were a unit. "We're going to be okay," he said. "I don't have all the pieces yet, but I know we're going to be okay." She looked at him for another moment, doing the calculation that children of single parents learn to do earlier than they should, the one where they assess whether the adult is actually okay or just performing okay. He knew she was doing it because he'd watched her do it enough times to recognize the particular quality of silence. "Pasta's good," she said finally. "I thought so too." She got up and went to wash her hands, and he turned back to the stove, and the rain had mostly stopped outside, and the kitchen was warm and smelled like garlic. Thought he'd intervened, and he stood there cooking dinner in his own kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon, while most of his former colleagues were sitting in an executive meeting he'd just walked out of, and he thought, I made the right call. He didn't know what came next. For the first time, in a long time, what he'd done that day felt entirely like his own decision, not something that had been managed out of him, not something he'd been finessed into. He had looked at the situation clearly, identified the line he would not cross, and not crossed it. Was not nothing. Vivian Marlowe, in the 48th floor conference room of Hargrove Tower, would not find out until the following week what Caleb Hartman was going to do next. She would spend the rest of that evening completely confident that he would be calling by morning, asking to come back. She would spend the rest of that week learning that confidence had been the most expensive mistake of her career. But that was not yet. Pasta, a kitchen with the lights on, a daughter with graphite on her wrist. That was enough. The call from Sterling Vector came at 7:14 the next morning. Caleb was at the kitchen counter, making Lily's lunch turkey on wheat, no mustard, apple slices in a separate compartment, because she didn't like them touching the sandwich, which was a preference he'd stopped questioning 2 years ago when his phone vibrated against the tile. He glanced at the screen. Dana, Vivienne's assistant. He set it face down and finished wrapping the sandwich. It rang again while he was driving Lily to school. "You gonna get that?" Lily asked from the back seat, not looking up from the book she was reading. "Work? Former work." She looked up then, looked at the back of his head with that particular 10-year-old assessment, then went back to her book. "Okay." He dropped her at the curb, watched her walk through the school doors without looking back, which was normal. She'd stopped looking back in September, and he'd made his peace with it and drove home through a morning that was considerably calmer than the previous one. The storm had cleared out overnight and left everything washed and sharp-edged, the mountains visible from the highway in the kind of detail you only got after serious rain. By 9 o'clock, he'd missed 4 calls from Sterling Vector numbers. By 10, he had an email from Dana marked urgent, with 2 exclamation points in the subject line, which struck him as slightly desperate for a company that had told him he was nothing less than 24 hours ago. He read it. He did not reply. What he did instead was something practical. He opened a spreadsheet and started doing an honest accounting of where things stood. Savings more than most people, his salary bracket managed, because he'd been careful since his wife died and careful before that. No. Mortgage manageable for approximately 5 months without income before it became a real problem. Lily's school tuition wasn't due again until spring. Health insurance, this was the one that needed addressing fastest because COBRA coverage was expensive, and there was no version of his life where Lily went without health insurance. He listed the problems in order of urgency and started identifying the options next to each one. It was not a comfortable exercise, but it was better than sitting in his feelings, which he'd never been particularly good at anyway. By 11:30, he had a rough 6-week plan and a list of 3 former colleagues he trusted enough to call about contract work. He also had 16 missed communications from Sterling Vector in various forms, which told him something interesting. They were not behaving like a company that had smoothly replaced a mid-level engineer. They were behaving like a company with a problem. The problem, as Preston Hale was discovering in real time, was considerable. Preston had spent the better part of Tuesday morning assuring Vivienne that the situation was manageable, that Caleb's departure was unfortunate but not critical, that the engineering team could cover his responsibilities, that the launch timeline could hold. He had said these things with the particular polished confidence that had carried him through 15 years of corporate navigation, and Vivienne had listened with the particular focused expression that meant she was deciding whether to believe him. By Tuesday afternoon, the hospital networks had started calling. Angry calls, confused ones. 3 different hospital systems infrastructure directors wanted to confirm technical details about the emergency relay configuration before giving final sign-off, and they had all independently asked to speak with Caleb Hartman specifically, the company, Caleb, by name. Preston had fielded the first call himself, gotten 12 minutes into a technical explanation he didn't fully understand, and been asked a question he couldn't answer. He'd promised to call back. Then he'd gone to the engineering floor and spent TC trying to find someone who could speak to the specific relay synchronization parameters the hospital director had mentioned, and what he discovered was that the engineers who understood it deeply enough to answer those specific questions had all, for 3 years, been bringing their hardest problems to Caleb because they were required to, because he was the person who actually knew. Preston called Dana. Dana told him Vivienne was in back-to-back investor prep meetings until 4. He sat in his office and pulled up Caleb's internal project files. There were hundreds of them, meticulously organized, dated, cross-referenced. And what Preston found, as he scrolled through them with a tightening sensation in his chest, was that an extraordinary amount of the technical work that had gone into Sterling Vector's most successful infrastructure projects over the past 4 years had originated in these documents. Problem identification, solution frameworks, testing protocols, all of it, written in Caleb's characteristic style, plain, precise, no wasted language. And then Preston found something that made the tightening sensation move from his chest to somewhere lower and colder. He found the original drafts. His own presentations, the ones he'd delivered to Vivienne, the ones that had earned him his title and his position and his reputation as Sterling Vector's strategic mastermind, were seen it as, in Caleb's filing system, by working documents that looked almost exactly like them. Same frameworks, same analysis structure, same core recommendations. Caleb's versions were written in engineering language rather than executive language, but the thinking was identical. Preston had spent 4 years translating Caleb's work into boardroom presentations and presenting it as his own strategic insight. He hadn't invented this system deliberately. That was the thing. It had developed gradually, almost organically. First, he'd borrowed a framing from one of Caleb's reports, because it was cleaner than what he'd drafted himself. Then he'd summarized a technical recommendation in his own voice. Slowly, the summaries had become presentations, had become strategy, had become his entire professional identity at this company. He closed the files, sat very still in his leather chair, then opened his email and sent Vivienne a message suggesting they delay the launch by a brief technical review period for due diligence purposes. Vivienne replied in 4 words, "Come see me now." Caleb did not know any of this yet. What he knew on Wednesday morning was that his phone had gone quiet overnight. Sterling Vector had stopped calling around 7 the previous evening, which either meant they'd found a solution or they'd decided to leave him alone. He wasn't sure which he preferred. He'd spent Tuesday evening doing something he hadn't done in months. He'd gone into the backyard after dinner and started working on the garden beds that had been sitting unfinished since September. The soil was wet from the storm and cold enough that he could see his breath. But there was something genuinely useful about the work, the kind where you could see the progress directly, where the measure of success was right in front of you. Yes, he'd intervened. He'd gotten 2 beds turned over and was starting on the border edging when Lily had come to the back door and watched him for a minute. "It's dark out," she said. "The back porch light reaches. Barely. Enough." She'd stood there another moment. "Are you okay?" He'd paused, hands in dirt, and looked at his daughter standing in the lit doorway in her socks. He said, "Actually, yeah, I'm okay." She'd given him the assessment look again, concluded something satisfactory, and gone back inside. He'd worked until 8:30, came in, washed up, made tea, and slept better than he had in weeks. Call from Marcus Ellington came Thursday morning. Caleb almost didn't answer it, because the number was unfamiliar, and he'd developed a mild phone aversion over the past 3 days. But something made him pick up, some instinct he couldn't have justified if asked. "Mr. Hartman," said the voice on the other end. "My name is Marcus Ellington. I'm the CEO of Frontier Core Systems. I'd like to buy you breakfast if you're available." Caleb stood in his kitchen, holding his coffee mug. "Who you are," he said. "I figured you might. You're also my former employer's largest competitor." "That's accurate. So I'm going to ask you a direct question," Caleb said. "Is this a breakfast meeting or a job offer?" A brief pause. "I was planning to work up to that over eggs, but probably both." Caleb looked out the kitchen window at the backyard, where the turned garden beds were visible in the morning light, dark and clean. "Where?" he said. Marcus Ellington was 53 years old, which meant he'd been building infrastructure companies since Caleb was in college. He was not the kind of from visual impact. He was medium height, slightly heavy, wore clothes that fit well without calling attention to themselves, and had the manner of someone who'd spent decades in rooms where the most important thing was listening accurately rather than appearing impressive. He was already at the table when Caleb arrived at the diner, a booth in a corner, away from the window, which suggested he'd either thought about privacy or simply preferred not to sit in direct sunlight. Both were equally plausible. He had coffee. He stood when Caleb came in, which Caleb noticed because not everyone did that. They shook hands. Sat down. The waitress came and Caleb ordered eggs and toast without looking at the menu, because he was a person who knew what he wanted from diners. They talked about the storm for approximately 45 seconds, which was the amount of small talk two engineers required before moving to the actual subject. I followed your work for a long time, Marcus said. Longer than you'd probably be comfortable knowing. How long? The St. Francis Hospital emergency 3 years ago. Drove through the night to get there when their primary backup system failed during that ice storm. You were there before the company even officially dispatched a response team. Caleb wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. You knew about that? That the clients who use Sterling Vector's hospital infrastructure trust that system because of you specifically, because of the company brand, because engineers and facilities directors have passed your name around for 3 years as the person who shows up and knows what he's doing. Marcus paused. I also know that at least 3 major innovations in Sterling Vector's emergency relay architecture over the past 4 years were originally your work and were presented upward through channels that gave someone else the credit. The restaurant was filling up, around them morning crowd, the particular comfortable noise of a busy diner that made conversation private by volume. Caleb looked at his coffee cup. How do you know that? He said. Because 2 of your former colleagues have approached us about positions in the last 18 months, and in both conversations, your name came up without me asking for it. Both times the context was essentially that you were the reason certain things worked at Sterling Vector, that the company didn't fully understand were working because of you. Caleb was quiet for a moment. What are you offering? He said. Marcus reached into his jacket and placed a folded piece of paper on the table between them, which Caleb thought was an interesting way to deliver a job offer printed on paper like a contract term sheet. No theater about it. Caleb unfolded it and read it. The title was Executive Vice President of Critical Infrastructure. The salary was 70% higher than what he'd been making at Sterling Vector, which was already not a small number. The description of responsibilities was specific and technical rather than vague and aspirational, which told him someone who understood the work had written it. There was a clause about scheduling flexibility and remote work provisions, which he read twice. The flexibility clause, Caleb said. I was told you have a daughter, Marcus said. I have 2 kids. I know what it means to have a schedule that doesn't account for a school play or a sick day. The clause is real. It's not a recruiting line. Caleb folded the paper again. He did not fold it the same way it had come. He folded it in thirds, which was how he folded things he was taking with him. I need to ask you something, he said. Go ahead. The synchronization defect in Sterling Vector's hospital rollout. I identified it 2 weeks ago. I resigned 3 days ago because they refused to delay the launch for testing. He looked at Marcus directly. Whether Frontier Core makes the same kind of decision. Marcus held his gaze. We've made bad decisions, Marcus said. I won't tell you we haven't. We've launched systems too fast twice in the past 5 years, and both times we paid for it in remediation costs and client trust that took 18 months to rebuild. He paused. But I will tell you that I have never not once been informed of a specific documented safety defect in hospitals' infrastructure, and chosen to launch anyway for financial reasons. If you find something like that at Frontier Core, I want to know about it. Directly, not filtered through 3 layers of management. Caleb looked at him for a moment. I'll need a few days, Caleb said. Of course, to think about it. And to talk to my daughter. Marcus nodded. He did not add anything to that, which Caleb appreciated. Senate intervened. They finished breakfast and talked for another 20 minutes about infrastructure standards and the state of emergency grid systems in the Mountain West. Yes, because both of them were the kind of people who found that more interesting than most other conversation topics. The eggs were good. The coffee was refilled twice. When they stood to leave, Marcus shook his hand again. For what it's worth, Marcus said. What you did Monday walking out of that room, that's not something most people do. Most people have a mortgage, Caleb said. So do you. Yeah, Caleb said. I do. He drove home thinking about it. Frantically, not running projections and anxieties in a loop. Just turning it over. The way he turned over an engineering problem when he was first getting familiar with its shape. That same Thursday afternoon, Vivian Marlowe was in a conference room on the 48th floor having a conversation she had not anticipated needing to have. The independent engineering firm she'd retained quietly, quickly, without announcing it internally, had submitted their preliminary findings. She was reading the report with Dana beside her and two members of her legal team across the table. Her face was doing very little. Her hands were flat on the table. The report confirmed a synchronization defect in the emergency relay system, described the failure conditions in terms that were notably similar to the terms Caleb Hartman had used in the executive meeting 3 days ago. It recommended a delay of the hospital network launch, pending testing and correction. It used the phrase potential for cascade overload under high-demand blackout conditions, which was word for word what Caleb had said. Vivian set the report down. "The launch," she said, "has to be postponed," said her legal counsel. He'd intervened. A careful woman named Rachel Osee, who had been with Sterling Vector for 6 years and who spoke with particular measured precision of someone accustomed to delivering news that nobody in the room wanted to hear. "Liability exposure. If we proceed, and there's an incident." "I know what the liability exposure is," Vivian said. "The hospitals need to be notified today, and the investors need to know before." The room was quiet. "How long for the correction?" Vivian asked. "The firm estimates 4 to 6 days for proper testing and adjustment," Rachel said, "assuming the team can identify the exact failure point." 96 hours, Caleb had said. 4 days. Vivian stood up, walked to the window, looked out at Black Ridge, spread below Hargrove Tower, the Rockies beyond it, the morning light doing what it always did over that particular landscape, turning ordinary things into something that looked almost important. "Get the hospital network directors on a call," she said. "This afternoon." A pause. "And find out who we have who can actually run the correction protocol. Someone who knows this system." Dana, who had worked for Vivian long enough to know certain things without being told them, said carefully, "Should I reach out to Caleb Hartman?" Vivian didn't turn from the window. "No," she said. Another pause. "Not yet." By Friday, Sterling Vector's engineering floor was in the particular variety of organized crisis that looks from the outside like controlled activity, but feels from the inside like controlled panic. 3 senior engineers were working on the relay synchronization correction. They were capable engineers, thorough, careful, credentialed. They were not Caleb Hartman, and the gap between those two things was becoming more apparent by the hour. Because they weren't competent. Not because they weren't competent, but because they were rebuilding an understanding of a complex system from documentation that was thorough but could not replicate the years of context that Caleb carried in his head. Preston Hale moved through all of this with the particular expression of a man who understood that something structural was cluttering around him but had not yet accepted that he was part of the structure. He had been managing his anxiety by being visible and confident in rooms, nodding during technical discussions he only partially followed, asking questions that sounded strategic, thanking engineers for their work with the kind of practiced warmth that reads as leadership. No, until you've seen it often enough to recognize the gap between the performance and the substance. He had survived on this for 4 years. He had developed a genuine belief in his own version of events, which was the most dangerous kind of self-deception, because it felt like confidence. On Friday afternoon, one of the junior engineers, a woman named Priya, who had been at Sterling Vector for 18 months and had worked closely with Caleb on 2 hospital network installations, came to his office with a question about the relay correction documentation. "The fault isolation protocol in Caleb's test files," she said, standing in his doorway with a tablet and an expression that was carefully neutral. "The original version from 2 years ago. Do you know where that is? Because the version in the shared drive seems like it's a revised copy, and I'm trying to understand what changed and why." Preston looked at her. "The original documentation," he said, "should all be in the project archive." "That's the thing," she said. "It is, but there are some gaps. Places where his work references source analysis that I can't find in the archive. And some of those source documents, the technical analysis behind the correction framework, they're cited in your Q3 2022 strategy presentation." She paused. "As your original analysis." The silence between them lasted 3 seconds. Preston said, "I'll look into it." Priya said, "Okay," in a tone that was polite and specific and communicated several things simultaneously, without being unprofessional about any of them. She left. Preston closed his office door. He sat in his chair. He looked at the framed article on his wall, a trade publication profile from 2 years ago, with the headline Sterling Vector's Strategic Visionary above his photograph. He looked at it for a long time. Caleb told Lily about the Frontier Corps offer on Friday evening. The full details, not the salary numbers, which he thought were too much information for a 10-year-old, but the shape of it. Company, better terms, real decision-making authority, a schedule that actually allowed him to be at her school events. They were in the living room. She was on the floor doing homework, or at least in the vicinity of homework. There were math worksheets involved, but also a library book open next to them, which suggested the homework was proceeding at its own pace. He sat on the couch with his laptop and the Frontier Corps offer document and the notes he'd been making on it, and he explained the situation in the way he tried to explain most things to her, accurately, without pretending the complications weren't there. "You're going to take it?" she said, not looking up from whatever she was writing. "I'm thinking about it." "What are you thinking?" He looked at the ceiling for a moment. "I'm thinking that it's a good opportunity. I'm thinking that Marcus Ellington seems like someone who actually means what he says, which is not as common as it should be. I'm thinking that the work is important, and I'd be good at it." "What else?" He looked at her. She was still writing, but she was listening completely, which was a trick she'd had since she was small. She could do two things at once in a way he could not. "I'm thinking that it's a big change," he said. "New company, new people, new everything. And I'm thinking about whether that's hard for you." She put her pencil down then, looked up at him. "Dad," she said, "you already quit the other job. You can't work nowhere forever." He looked at her. "That's true. And you like infrastructure stuff. And you said the schedule is better. Significantly better." She picked up her pencil again. "Then take it," as if this were entirely simple, as though the only thing required was identifying the relevant facts and following them to the conclusion. He smiled. Not a big smile. Just the kind that happened when he wasn't trying to make one. "I'll let you know what I decide," he said. "You're going to take it," she said without looking up. He was going to take it. He called Marcus Ellington on Saturday morning, while Lily was still asleep, and the house was quiet, and the mountains were visible from the kitchen window in that particular sharp-edged post-storm clarity that he'd always thought was the best thing about living in Colorado. He told Marcus, yes. He told him about the technical integrity standard he wanted to build into his terms, not as a negotiating chip, but as an actual condition. The standard he was imagining would require an independent engineering review whenever a documented safety concern was raised, regardless of financial pressure. Marcus listened to the whole thing without interrupting. Then said, "Write it up. Bring it Monday. You haven't heard the specifics yet." "I don't need to. If you're putting a requirement in writing that protects engineers who raise safety specifics, I want to hear the specifics and I want to say yes to them." A pause. "You may have noticed I've been trying to hire you for 3 days. I'm not going to argue with you about the thing you care most about." Caleb looked out the window at the mountains. "Monday," he said. "Monday," Marcus agreed. By the time Caleb was driving to Frontier Corps' offices on Monday morning, Sterling Vector's marketing team was quietly dismantling the press release they'd scheduled for Tuesday. The hospital network launch had been formally postponed. The correction protocol was running. 14 hospital network directors had received calls that were managed carefully, but could not fully conceal the particular texture of a scrambling to fix something it had almost gotten wrong in a very public way. Vivian Marlowe had spent her weekend in a way she had not spent a weekend in several years, reading original engineering reports, summaries, not Preston's executive translations, the actual documents. She had called her engineering team lead twice with questions that were, by that team's lead's surprised assessment, actually pretty good technical questions. She was not, in those 48 hours, having an easy time. But she was, for perhaps the first time in her 5 years running this company, having an accurate one. And on Monday morning, while she sat in her office, looking at a revised launch timeline and a preliminary investigation report that was beginning to raise some very uncomfortable questions about the source of Sterling Vector's strategic innovations over the past 4 years, her assistant Dana set a tablet on her desk with a news alert open. Frontier Corps Systems had just issued a press release announcing the appointment of Caleb Hartman as Executive Vice President of Critical Infrastructure. The accompanying quote from Marcus Ellington described Caleb as one of the most trusted technical minds in regional emergency infrastructure, whose commitment to safety standards has made hospital networks across Colorado more reliable for years. Vivian read it twice. She set the tablet face down. She sat in her chair for a long moment, looking at the view she had spent 5 years building the right to occupy the mountains, the valley, the city below, and thought about a question she hadn't fully asked herself until now. How much of this company had rested on Caleb Hartman's shoulders? She was beginning to understand the answer to that one. The question she was sitting with, in the particular quiet of a Monday morning, in an office that suddenly felt several degrees colder than it had on Friday, was simpler and harder. What had she actually built, and what had she just been standing next to? She didn't have the answer yet. The getting of it was going to be uncomfortable and slow and require more honesty than she was accustomed to applying to herself. But she was starting to ask it. That was something. Maybe. The investigation didn't announce itself. That was the thing about institutional reckonings they rarely did. They began quietly, in filing systems and archived emails, and the particular way certain people started avoiding eye contact in hallways. And by the time the full shape of the thing became visible, it had already been growing in the dark for longer than anyone wanted to admit. Vivian had commissioned the internal audit the same week the independent engineering firm confirmed Caleb's findings. She'd framed it internally as a documentation integrity review language that was accurate but deliberately mild, the kind of framing that kept people from lawyering up before you had what you needed. Rachel Ossie had advised her on the phrasing. Rachel was very good at that kind of thing. The audit team was 3 people, one from legal, from finance, and an outside consultant named Douglas Park, who specialized in corporate documentation forensics and had the particular effect of someone who had spent 20 years finding things that organizations wished he hadn't found. He wore the same gray cardigan every time Vivian saw him, which was either eccentricity or efficiency, and she decided it didn't matter. They worked quietly for 10 days. Vivian went about the normal operations of the company during those 10 days: investor calls, board updates, the managed communications around the delayed hospital launch, the careful reconstruction of a public narrative that acknowledged a technical delay without using words like defect or nearly catastrophic. She was good at this. Running a company under pressure was something she'd done since she was 25, and she'd learned early that the appearance of controlled authority was sometimes the thing that held everything together while you fixed what was actually wrong. Underneath all of it, she was waiting. She found out on a Tuesday morning, 11 days after the audit began, when Douglas Park sat down across from her desk with a manila folder and the expression of a man who had found what he expected to find and was not pleased about it. "Walk me through it," she said. He walked her through it. It took 40 minutes. He was methodical and specific, and he used document timestamps and metadata and version histories and email chains. And what emerged from all of it was not a dramatic reveal, so much as a slow, accumulating weight, the kind that builds without announcing itself until you look up and realize you're carrying something much heavier than you thought. For at least 2.5 years, Preston Hale had been taking Caleb Hartman's original technical analyses, the problem identifications, the solution frameworks, the risk assessments, the correction protocols, and reprocessing them into executive strategy presentations that he delivered to Vivienne and the board as his own original thinking. He hadn't copied them verbatim. He was too careful for that. He had translated them engineering language into executive language, technical specificity into strategic framing, and in the translation had erased the origin so completely that even someone paying close attention would have had difficulty tracing the lineage. He had done this systematically, not in a moment of opportunism, but as a sustained practice. "How many presentations?" Vivian asked. Douglas Park opened the folder to a tabbed page. "We've confirmed 14 that contain substantial material, originating in Hartman's undistributed reports. There are 7 more we're still working to verify." He paused. "Including the Q2 2023 infrastructure strategy that you presented to the board as the basis for your hospital network expansion." Vivian looked at the page. That presentation had been the foundation for $600 million in contracts. The promotion, she said. Douglas looked up. In 2022, Caleb Hartman was passed over for a senior director promotion. That review went through Preston's office. Douglas turned to another tabbed section. Promotion Committee notes from that review are in here. Mr. Hale submitted an assessment indicating that while Mr. Hartman was technically competent, he lacked the leadership presence and strategic thinking required for senior executive roles. Vivian read the notes. She set the folder down very carefully. He blocked the promotion, she said. Not a question. The evidence is strongly consistent with that interpretation, Douglas said. Keeping Hartman at his current level ensured he continued producing the underlying work without the organizational visibility that might have led others to recognize his contributions. The office was very quiet. From where she sat, Vivian could see the framed Sterling Vector mission statement on the opposite wall, something about integrity and innovation and excellence that she had approved 5 years ago and had read so many times it had become invisible. She looked at it now. "What's your recommendation?" she said. "That's outside my scope," Douglas said. "My scope was documentation forensics. What you do with it is your decision." She appreciated that he didn't try to soften it. After he left, she sat alone in her office for 22 minutes. Dana knew not to interrupt her during periods like this. She'd worked for Vivian long enough to read the particular quality of a closed door. Vivian picked up her phone and called Rachel Osei. "I need you to prepare for a termination," she said. "Preston Hale, full documentation package. And I want to be careful, thorough, airtight, and fast." Rachel was quiet for 1 second. "I'll start today." Today, Vivian confirmed. She hung up, looked out the window. She was thinking about a conference room, about 14 executives sitting around a long table, about a quiet man in a dark jacket setting a folder of test results on the table and asking, not demanding, not performing, no, just asking for 96 hours of first to fix something before it hurt someone, about what she had said to him instead. Preston Hale was suspended pending investigation on a Wednesday afternoon, which was a gray and unremarkable day that gave nothing away about its significance. He was called into Vivian's office at 3 o'clock, and Rachel Osei was already there, which was the first signal that this was not a routine meeting. The second signal was the folder on Vivian's desk. Preston sat down and looked at it. He had a very good poker face. He had spent a long time developing it. "We've completed a documentation audit," Vivian said. She did not sit behind her desk. She stood beside the window, not for theatrical effect Caleb would have recognized, but because she was the kind of person who couldn't stay still when she was angry and had learned to make the movement look deliberate. "I'm going to give you the opportunity to tell me what you want to tell me before I tell you what we found." Preston said, "I'm not sure what this is about." "The technical analyses," Vivian said. "Caleb Hartman's reports, the presentations," a pause. "Very brief, but there. I synthesized material from across the engineering team," Preston said. "That's what strategic leadership does. It takes technical input and translates it into." Preston, her voice was not loud. "The metadata on your Q3 2022 hospital strategy presentation shows it was created 40 minutes after Caleb's internal report was filed. The file was opened, the content was restructured, and the source document was moved to a restricted access archive that Caleb didn't have permissions to access." She paused. "That's not synthesis. That's something else." The room was very quiet. Preston looked at the folder. He looked at Rachel. He looked at his own hands, which were not moving in the easy, performed way they usually did. "I built the relationships," he said finally. His voice had changed, lost some of its surface finish. What was underneath was not quite what the surface had suggested. "I got this company into those boardrooms. I created the strategic vision." With his analysis, he couldn't have communicated it. He doesn't know how to work a room. He doesn't know how to talk to investors. He doesn't understand that execution requires. "That is not what I'm talking about," Vivian said. "I'm talking about whether you took work that wasn't yours and presented it as though it was. That's what I'm talking about." Preston was quiet. "And the promotion," she said. 2022. "Your assessment that he lacked leadership presence." He didn't answer. "You needed him exactly where he was," she said. It was not a question, and she didn't frame it as one. "You needed him producing work that didn't have his name on it, at a salary level that kept him grateful for the stability, with a title that gave him no platform to recognize what was being done with his output. Preston looked at the window. Something moved across his face, not guilt exactly. Something more complicated, the expression of a person confronting the fact that a thing they'd told themselves was manageable has turned out not to be. "What happens now?" he said. "Not a question either. Suspend is effective today," Vivienne said. "The board has been notified. The investigation continues. Rachel will walk you through the process." She moved toward her desk. The movement was conclusive. "Vivienne, we're done here," she said. She sat down, opened her laptop, and Preston Hale, who had occupied a corner office on the 48th floor for 4 years, who had delivered presentations to boards, investors, and hospital networks, on the strength of another man's thinking, stood up and left the room. Caleb didn't know about the suspension when it happened. He'd entered. He was in the middle of a third week at Frontier Corps, which was complicated in the specific way that all new things are complicated before they become familiar. The offices were different. The systems were different. The team was different. And he was still in the particular disorientation of learning a new institutional landscape while being expected to lead within it. What he did know from the first week was that Marcus Ellington had not oversold the job. The engineers at Frontier Corps were good. Not uniformly good, there were gaps, as there were everywhere, and some of the existing infrastructure documentation was sloppier than he'd have liked. But the culture was different in a way he'd felt within the first 3 days, and had spent time trying to identify precisely. Eventually he'd concluded it was this: the engineers here complained about problems directly, rather than routing the complaints upward through management and waiting for permission to address them. It was a small thing. It changed everything. He'd been given an office, but spent most of his time on the engineering floor, which had surprised some people and hadn't surprised Marcus. "You're not a conference room person," Marcus had said. On Caleb's third day, passing through the engineering area and finding him there with 2 of the senior relay engineers, all 3 of them looking at a technical diagram with the focused energy of people who have forgotten they're at work. "Is that a problem?" Caleb had asked. "No, I just want to make sure you have what you need. I need to understand what we're actually working with before I make decisions about it," Caleb said. "The floor is where that happens." Marcus had nodded and kept walking, which was the right response. The technical integrity standard was the thing Caleb spent the most time on in those first weeks. He drafted it on paper before he came in, revised it twice after conversations with Marcus, and spent 4 days in working sessions with Frontier Corps' legal and engineering teams, refining the language into something that could actually function as policy rather than just principle. The core of it was simple. When any engineer at any level documented a specific safety concern with testable evidence, that concern triggered an automatic independent review process that no executive, including the CEO, could unilaterally override for financial or timeline reasons. The review could be fast. It could be thorough and still conclude within 48 hours if needed. It happened every time, without exception. The legal team had questions. Some were good questions. One of the junior lawyers, a sharp woman named May, who asked things in a very direct way that reminded Caleb slightly of Lily, had pushed back on the no executive override clause. "What if the concern is clearly speculative?" May asked. "What if an engineer is raising a flag for reasons that have nothing to do with actual safety interpersonal issues? A bad day. No. Something personal? The standard requires documented, testable evidence," Caleb said. "Speculation doesn't meet the threshold. But if the evidence is there, the review happens of who's inconvenienced by the timing. And if a review creates a significant financial problem for a contract, then we have a documented record showing we found the problem and addressed it, which is worth more in long-term client trust than whatever we lose in the short-term delay." He paused. "I can tell you from personal experience what it costs when the review doesn't happen." Looked at him for a moment, then wrote something in her notes. Standard was finalized and formally adopted in his 4th week. Marcus signed it in a small conference room with about 12 people present, which was less ceremony than some people had wanted, but which Caleb preferred. It wasn't a celebration. It was a policy. Policies were for doing, not for celebrating. The hospital networks noticed. immediately, and not dramatically. Institutional trust doesn't move fast in either direction, but over the next weeks, as Caleb began making contact with the infrastructure directors at the hospitals that Frontier Corps served, there was a quality to those conversations that he hadn't expected. The directors talked to him the way people talk to someone they've been waiting to hear from. No, because of his title. Because they'd heard his name connected to reliability in a specific, practical, field-tested way. And reliability was the thing they cared about most. One director, a woman named Sandra Okafor, at a regional medical center outside Blackridge said it directly during a site visit. "I'm doing this for 19 years, she said. Yes, Gind. They were walking the emergency power corridor, which smelled like concrete and electrical conduit in the particular way that those spaces always did. And the thing I've learned is that the companies who put engineers in charge of the safety decisions are the ones I can sleep at night trusting. The ones who put the sales team in charge of those conversations." She paused. "Those are the ones I have nightmares about." "I'm an executive now," Caleb said. "You're an engineer with a title," she said. "That's different." He thought about that on the drive back to the Frontier's Corps offices. Thought about how long it had taken him to be seen clearly enough for that distinction to matter, and about what it had cost in the meantime. The news about Preston reached him through his former colleague Priya, who texted him on a Friday afternoon with 3 words, "You should know," followed by a link to an internal Sterling Vector communication that had apparently made its way into the hands of people who shared things, the way things always did in a company that size. Caleb read it twice, sat with it. He wasn't sure what he felt. He'd expected to feel more satisfaction than he did. What he actually felt was something closer to tired, the specific tiredness that comes from learning that something bad you suspected was real had turned out to be real. And confirmation doesn't make it better, just verified. He texted Priya back, "Thank you for telling me." He didn't share it with anyone else that day. He drove home, picked up Lily from her science club. 20 minutes late, she was standing outside two kids with and she looked up when his car pulled in with the expression of someone who had decided to be pointedly patient, and they stopped for burgers on the way home, because Fridays sometimes required. The burger place, which was loud and warm and smelled like fried things. Lily told him about a project she was working on, a small structural model built from balsa wood that was supposed to support a specific weight. She'd gotten the design almost right, but the joints kept failing. "Where are they failing?" Caleb asked. "The corners," she said, pulling a napkin toward her and starting to sketch something with the pen she always had in her jacket pocket. "I did the reinforcement thing you showed me, but it's still..." "Show me." She showed him. He looked at the sketch. "The load path," he said. "Your reinforcement is in the right place, but the angle is off. The stress is traveling down the member instead of distributing through the joint. You need to change the orientation." She studied the sketch. "A mark on it." "Oh," she said. "Yeah, she made another mark. That's annoying. That's like 2 hours of rebuilding." She looked at the sketch again, then folded it up and put it in her pocket. "Fine." She picked up her burger. "Did something happen today?" "You seem," she considered, "regular, but also like something happened." He looked at her. She was 10 years old. She had a smear of ketchup on her chin and an engineering sketch in her pocket, and she was watching him with complete attention. "I found out today that the thing I thought was happening at my old company was actually happening," he said. "The credit stealing. It was confirmed." She was quiet for a moment. "That sucks." "It does. Are you glad you left?" "More glad than I was before today," he said. "A fry." "Good." It wasn't complicated, from where she sat. He found that he appreciated the uncomplicated version. The board at Sterling Vector opened the formal investigation into Preston the following week, and Vivian found her authority over technical operations temporarily restructured, not stripped but audited, which felt in practice like the same thing. 2 independent board members were added to the Technical Oversight Committee. Every safety certification now required dual sign-off. The arrangement was described publicly as a strengthening of governance structures and was accurate in its description, even if the reason behind it was something nobody was saying out loud. She accepted it without fighting it. This surprised people who had worked with her for a long time. What she was doing in those weeks was something she hadn't done before, In any systematic way, she was reading executive summaries, not quarterly reports. She was reading the original engineering documentation, the reports, the field assessments, the failure analyses that her company had been generating for years and that had been reaching her until now only after being filtered through layers of management translation. It was slow. Some of it was technical in ways she had to look up. She asked her engineering team lead, a quiet man named Gabriel, who had been at Sterling Vector for 8 years, and who visibly did not know how to process the CEO, asking him to explain relay synchronization concepts, to spend 30 minutes with her twice a week going through the technical context of active projects. The first session was awkward. Gabriel clearly expected her to get bored or impatient. She didn't. She asked questions that were, as Gabriel later described to Priya with some bewilderment, actually pretty good questions. She wanted to know the why, he said. Not just what the system does. Why it's designed that way. What did you tell her? Priya asked. Everything, Gabriel said. He still seemed slightly surprised by the conversation. She just sat there and listened, took notes. Priya thought about that. None of this fixed what had happened. It didn't give Caleb back the 4 years of credit he'd had taken from him, or the promotion he'd been maneuvered out of, or the particular kind of exhaustion that came from spending years doing work that someone else put their name on. Those things were not fixable. They were just true. But something was shifting in the building. Slowly, imperfectly, the way things shift when the structure has been shaken hard enough that it can no longer hold its original shape. The 7 hospital networks called the meeting in October. It came as a formal invitation, a consortium review, they called it, which was the industry term for a gathering of major clients conducting a collective assessment of their infrastructure partners. Both Sterling Vector and Frontier Core were invited. The meeting was at a hotel conference center in Denver, neutral ground, and the explicit agenda was contract review and future procurement decisions. The implicit agenda, which everyone understood and nobody stated directly, was that the hospital networks had watched the Sterling Vector launch delay very carefully and were conducting a structured reassessment of who they trusted with their emergency infrastructure. Vivian received the invitation and spent an evening looking at it. The dollar figures involved in these contracts were significant, not company-defining, but close. Losing them would not destroy Sterling Vector. Keeping them, or losing them, would say something very specific about where the company stood. She called her team. They prepared. She prepared. She arrived at the hotel on a Tuesday morning wearing a charcoal jacket she'd bought specifically for important rooms, which was a small vanity she'd never entirely shed, and walked into the conference center with 3 people from her technical and legal teams, and the particular forward momentum she used when she was in a situation she intended to control. The consortium were already seated 7 infrastructure directors from hospital systems across Colorado, representing collectively about 400 hospital beds and the emergency infrastructure supporting them. Sandra Okafor was there. Vivienne recognized 2 others she'd met before. The Frontier Core team had not yet arrived. Then the door opened. Vivienne had prepared herself, in a general way, for Marcus Ellington to lead the Frontier Core presentation. She'd researched him, reviewed their public communications, prepared responses to his likely positions. Caleb Hartman walked into the room. He was wearing dark slacks and a jacket that fit the same way his clothes always had adequately without theater. Yet he'd intervened. His hair had a little more gray at the temples than it had in the Sterling Vector conference room 4 months ago, or maybe she was just looking more carefully. He carried a folder. He moved without hurrying. He took the seat directly across from Vivienne Marlowe. The last time they'd faced each other across a table, she had told him he was nothing, and he had set his badge down and walked out into a storm. He set his folder on the table, looked across at her without expression, not coldness, not triumph, just the level and specific attention he brought to everything, and said, to the room at large, "Good morning, said Sandra Okafor. A few others echoed it. Vivian said, "Good morning," in the voice she used when she was managing something carefully. The meeting was called to order. Caleb spoke first, which surprised people who expected Marcus to lead. He talked about the technical integrity standard at Frontier Core, what it required, how it worked, the specific protections it built into to safety certification in the plain, specific way he explained everything. He talked about the hospitals Frontier Corps currently served, the response times, the documentation quality, what independent review actually looked like in practice rather than in policy language. Vivian presented Sterling Vector's case. She was direct. She acknowledged the launch delay without minimizing it. She described the governance changes without overselling them. Yes, she did not pretend the preceding months had been anything other than what they were. Unexpectedly, Caleb said something. The correction protocol that Sterling Vector implemented, he said, addressing the room. Relay the relay synchronization fix. If they followed the testing sequence I outlined, and based on what I've reviewed publicly, they appear to have then the system should function correctly under blackout conditions. I can't confirm this independently because I don't have access to their current documentation, but the engineering approach appears sound. The room was very still. Several of the hospital directors exchanged looks. Vivian looked at Caleb. He met her eyes. Not pointedly, just directly. I'm saying this because it's what the data suggests, he said. Because of anything else. What happened next was what nobody in that room had entirely prepared for. Director Okafor leaned forward. I have a question about the 6-day extension. The additional testing period after the correction. Sterling Vector, who authorized that decision. All eyes moved to Vivienne. She was quiet for one moment. Then I did. Against the original timeline? Against a financial pressure to launch on a date that the engineering review indicated was premature, she said. Who recommended the extension? She looked across the table. At Caleb, who had not recommended it because he'd already left, but whose entire position, the one he'd walked out of a room rather than abandoned, had been the argument for exactly that kind of extension from the very beginning. The engineering data recommended it, Vivian said. We followed the data. The room considered this. Director Okafor made a note. The other directors made notes. The particular quality of the room shifted slightly the way it shifts when a decision is forming that hasn't yet been announced. I want to be clear about one thing, Vivian said. She hadn't planned to say this. It arrived in the way that honest things sometimes do, without scheduled delivery. The delay happened because we identified a problem that should have been identified sooner. The reason it wasn't identified sooner is because the engineer who found it wasn't being heard the way he should have been. She paused. That's a governance failure. It's been addressed, but I want to say it directly, rather than allow the impression that we caught this early. We didn't. We caught it in time. Those are different things. The room was very quiet. Caleb was looking at her. She did not look back, because she was looking at the hospital directors, because that was where the conversation needed to go. But she felt him looking. Director Okafor said, "Thank you for saying that." The meeting continued for another 2 hours. Technical questions, protocol reviews, contract term discussions. The kind of detailed, specific, slightly exhausting work that was the actual substance of everything these companies did. During a break when most people had drifted toward the coffee station, and the side conversations that were, in their way, as important as anything said formally, Caleb found himself standing near the window looking out at the Denver skyline. He had a cup of coffee and was mostly thinking about a relay timing question one of the directors had raised that he wanted to follow up on. He heard footsteps. Stopped. Vivienne was standing about 4 feet away. She was not with her team. Yes, she had deliberately, or at least purposefully, moved away from the people she came with and crossed the room to stand near him. She had her coffee in one hand and the other hand in her jacket pocket, and she looked, for the first time in any room Caleb had shared with her, like someone who had not fully prepared what to say. It was an honest answer, he said, because it was true, and he wasn't interested in pretending otherwise. It should have been the approach from the beginning, she said. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, Denver was doing what Denver did on a clear October day, the particular sharp sky quality of high altitude and autumn light. You to know, she said, that Preston's investigation is complete. He's been terminated. The board has seen everything. I heard, Caleb said. The credit issue, your analyses, the presentations. We're working through how to address that in terms of formal documentation and record correction. She paused. I don't know if that matters to you at this point. He thought about it honestly. It matters that the record is accurate, he said, for the engineers who come after. It matters that the documentation reflects where the work actually came from. She said, I'll make sure of it. He nodded. She looked at him. She had the expression of someone who has more to say and is making a decision about whether to say it in this moment or a different one. The 6-day extension, she said. When the consortium asked me who recommended it, I heard your answer. It was the right answer. The data recommended it. She paused. But the data existed because of you. The framework for reading it correctly that was yours. I want you to know that I understand that. He looked at his coffee cup, at the skyline. Okay, he said, not dismissively. Just received. A Frontier Corps team member appeared at his elbow with a question about the relay specifications. Caleb turned to address it. When he glanced back toward where Vivienne had been standing, she had moved back across the room to her team. The break ended. The meeting resumed. By late afternoon, when the consortium directors excused themselves to deliberate, the particular quality of the room had changed in a way that was difficult to quantify, but that everyone present could feel. Something had been established, not just about contracts, but about how these companies understood themselves and what they were willing to say about it. Caleb drove back to Blackridge in the early evening, through the high plains, and then up into the mountains, where the last light was doing extraordinary things to the rock faces, and he drove through it without the radio on, meaned, thinking about a conference room 4 months ago, and a badge on a table, and a woman who had said he was nothing, with the precision of someone who believed it. She didn't believe it anymore. He wasn't sure what to do with that. It didn't undo the thing. It didn't give back what had been taken. Yes, he'd intervened, but it was a different kind of truth than the one she'd delivered in that conference room, and he was honest enough with himself to recognize that it had cost her something to say it. He merged onto the highway toward Blackridge. The mountains were losing their light behind him. He had a daughter at home who had rebuilt a balsa wood joint and wanted to show him how the load path worked now. He had a company with a policy in it that might protect people he'd never meet. He had a day behind him in which he'd sat across a table from the most powerful person in his former professional life and told the truth without hesitation and been listened to. It wasn't resolution exactly. Real things rarely resolved cleanly, but it was something solid, something that had his name on it, honestly, all the way through. The consortium's decision came on a Thursday, not dramatically, with ceremony. The way most consequential decisions in the infrastructure world arrived through a formal letter delivered electronically, written in the careful language of institutional communication that nonetheless managed, if you read it with enough attention, to say something precise about where a thing stood. Caleb was in the middle of a relay configuration review with 2 of his engineers at Frontier Corps when Market appeared in the doorway of the engineering room and held up his phone with a particular expression, not triumphant, relieved, something more measured than either. Expression of a man who has been in the industry long enough to know that good news and complicated news often arrived in the same envelope. "Give me 5 minutes," Caleb told his engineers. He followed Marcus to his office, which was a corner room that Marcus had never fully furnished. There were 2 chairs, a desk, a whiteboard covered in diagrams that had accumulated over months without being erased, and a plant in the corner that appeared to be surviving through stubbornness alone. Marcus pulled up the letter on his screen and turned it toward Caleb. Caleb read it standing up. Sterling Vector retained its existing hospital network installations, subject to independent quarterly technical oversight for a period of 18 months. The consortium's language around this was careful, but legible. Trust, once examined, required a period of demonstrated consistency before it could be considered restored. Sterling Vector would have the opportunity to demonstrate it. Installations remained active because the corrected system was, as the consortium's own technical reviewers had confirmed, functioning correctly. Caleb's name was not in the letter. His assessment in the Denver meeting was, in its way, everywhere in it. Frontier Corps received $220 million in new expansion contracts across 3 hospital systems, with Caleb designated as the lead engineer on all 3. He read it twice. 220, Marcus said. I read it, Caleb said. You want to say something about that? Caleb looked at the whiteboard. Someone had sketched a relay diagram on it weeks ago that bore a resemblance to the synchronization framework he'd developed at Sterling Vector, not copied. Just the kind of parallel thinking that happened when engineers in the same field were working on similar problems. He looked at it for a moment. "I want to make sure we have the staffing to do this right," he said. 3 systems simultaneously is manageable if we sequence the implementation correctly, but I need 2 more senior engineers on the team, and we need to extend the testing window on the Mercy Regional installation by at least a week. Their backup grid has some legacy components that aren't in the standard documentation. Marcus looked at him. "We just got $220 million in contracts," Marcus said. "And your first response is the testing window." "My first response is making sure we don't have a problem 6 months in," Caleb said. "Because that's what the 220 is built on. People trusting us not to have a problem 6 months in." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he almost smiled, the kind that happened when someone confirms something you already believed. "2 senior engineers," he said. "Done. The testing window talked to me about the Mercy Regional documentation gap, and we'll figure out what's reasonable." They talked for 40 minutes about implementation, sequencing, staffing, and the specific legacy grid issue at Mercy Regional, which turned out to be more complex than Caleb had initially flagged and required a separate conversation with that hospital's facilities team. By the time Caleb walked back to the engineering floor, the 220 had already become infrastructure and timeline and personnel, and the specific technical problem of a legacy grid interface, which was how it should be. One of his engineers, a young man named Theo, who had been at Frontier Corps for 2 years, and who asked more questions than almost anyone Caleb had worked with. Yes, he'd intervened, which Caleb considered a professional asset rather than an inconvenience, looked up from his workstation when Caleb came back. "Good news?" Theo asked. "We got the contracts." Theo made a sound that was somewhere between a cheer and a surprised exhalation. "All 3? All 3, which means we have a significant amount of work to do, and not as much time to do it as I'd like." Caleb pulled a chair over to the workstation and sat down. "Tell me where we are on the Riverside documentation." Theo blinked. "You want to debrief the contracts?" "After we do the Riverside documentation review. The contracts aren't going anywhere. The documentation timeline is." Theo turned back to his screen. He was grinning slightly, which he probably didn't know was visible. Sterling Vector's reaction to the decision was, on the surface, managed. Vivian issued a statement acknowledging the consortium's confidence in the corrected system and expressing commitment to the new oversight structure. It was the right statement. Dana had drafted it, and Vivian had revised it twice, which was unusual. She typically revised things once, fast, and moved on. This one she'd sat with. The internal reaction was different. Panic Sterling Vector was a large and functionally sound company that was not going to collapse because of one lost expansion contract cycle. But the people who understood the company's trajectory understood that $220 million going to Frontier Corps was not simply a contract number. It was a signal, the kind that hospital networks sent when they were repositioning their long-term trust, and those repositionings once made were slow to reverse. Gabriel, the engineering team lead, had a conversation with Vivian that same Thursday that would have surprised him 2 months ago, and that, given how the preceding weeks had gone, surprised him considerably less than it once would have. She called him into her office, not the executive suite, but the smaller working office she'd started using for technical discussions, the one with the whiteboard she'd been covering in questions and diagrams during their twice-weekly sessions. It was a different room than the one she'd occupied for 5 years, in a way that had nothing to do with geography. "Walk me through the Mercy Regional legacy grid issue," she said. He looked at her. "Hartman mentioned it in the consortium meeting," she said. "He flagged it as a documentation gap in the standard Frontier Corps implementation. I want to understand if we have similar gaps in our existing Sterling Vector installations." Gabriel sat down. "You've been following his technical assessments." "I've been following the technical record generally," she said. "But yes, specifically." She paused. "He has a way of identifying things that aren't in the obvious documentation. I want to know if our audit process would catch similar issues." It was not a comfortable thing to ask. Gabriel understood that she was essentially inquiring whether their quality assurance was strong enough to catch the kinds of things that Caleb had been catching for years when he was the one doing it. The implicit question being, what did we lose when he walked out? The honest answer was, more than we understood at the time. I'll put together a review, Gabriel said. Current installations. Documentation gaps against what our technical certification process would have required. How long? 2 weeks? 10 days, if I pull Priya and one of the senior field engineers. 10 days, she said. And Gabriel, I want it to be real. Not a review that's designed to confirm we're fine. A review that would tell me if we're not. He looked at her for a moment. Was something different in the room than there had been 6 months ago, a different quality of directness, like a conversation where both people had agreed to stop pretending certain things weren't true. That's a harder document to write, he said. I know, she said. Write it anyway. Caleb had been at Frontier Corps for almost 3 months when his sister Karen called on a Sunday afternoon. Karen was 4 years older than him, lived in Fort Collins, and had the particular quality of a person who could talk about difficult things directly without making them feel like confrontations. She'd been his closest person since his wife died, in the way that family sometimes steps into a space that nothing else can fill, imperfectly, but substantially. How are you actually doing? She said. Not a question. A Karen-specific statement that meant, don't give me the functional answer. He was in the backyard. The garden beds were looking considerably better than they had. In October, he'd gotten the border edging finished and had put in a small cold season planting that was probably overambitious for November in Colorado, but that he'd committed to regardless. Better, he said. Better than what? Better than I've been in probably 2 years, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Because of the job. He thought about it. Partly. Mostly because of how I feel about the decision I made. The job is good. But I don't know how to say this without it sounding like something you put on a motivational poster. Try. I feel like the work I'm doing is actually mine, he said. Like when something goes right, it's traceable back to a decision I made with my name on it. And when something goes wrong, same thing. There's no filter between me and the work. Does that make sense? Yes, Karen said. That makes complete sense. The Frontier Corps contracts came in Thursday, he added. Big ones. I saw. Marcus Ellington mentioned you in the press release. By name, he did. How did that feel? He looked at the garden beds. The cold season planting was probably going to do about 70% of what he was hoping for, which was fine. Accurate, he said. Karen laughed, a real one. The kind that you couldn't manufacture, is the most Caleb Hartman answer I have ever heard. It's accurate, he said again, but he was almost smiling. How's Lily? She rebuilt the balsa wood structure 3 times, he said. It holds weight now. She wants to enter it in some kind of junior engineering showcase. She going to win? The joint design is genuinely good, he said. Better than most of what I was doing at her age. Caleb, what, you sound happy. He thought about it, standing in his backyard on a cold Colorado Sunday, garden beds around him, the mountains visible over the roofline. He said, I think I actually am. The call from Vivian came in November, not through Dana, through legal or an intermediary of any kind. Her name appeared on his phone on a Wednesday evening when he was at the kitchen table going through Frontier Corps documentation, and he sat with it for 3 rings before answering. Vivian, he said, Caleb. A pause. I'm sorry to call you directly. I didn't want to go through channels for this. Okay. Another pause. She was someone who was accustomed to controlling the pace of conversations, and the pause had a quality of someone who had prepared what they were going to say and was now in the moment of actually saying it, discovering that preparation and execution were different things. I'd like to meet with you, she said, in person, about business, not about contracts or the consortium or anything professional. A beat. I want to apologize to you, properly, and I didn't want to do it in a letter or through someone else. Thought you deserved to have it said to your face. Caleb looked at the documentation in front of him, a relay timing schematic he'd been reviewing for the Mercy Regional installation, covered in his handwritten notes in the margins. When? He said. I'll work around your schedule. He thought for a moment. Saturday morning. There's a place called Carmichael's on Delaney. It's a coffee shop, not a restaurant. 8 be there, she said. Come alone, he said, harshly, just as a condition. Yes, she said. Of course. Carmichael's was the kind of place that had been in the same location for 23 years and showed it mismatched furniture, a counter that had been refinished twice and showed evidence of both attempts. Coffee that was excellent and served without any performance about being excellent. Caleb went there on Saturday mornings, sometimes when he didn't have Lily's schedule to organize around, mostly because the coffee was good and nobody bothered him. He arrived at 8:20 and got a table near the window, not because he wanted to watch for her arrival, but because the light was better there and he'd brought a book. He ordered coffee and read for 8 minutes. Vivienne arrived at 8:29. She was alone. She came through the door in a coat that was clearly expensive but not aggressively so, and she stood in the entrance for a moment, doing what people do when they're looking for someone in an unfamiliar room, scanning, locating, adjusting. She saw him, and something in her posture shifted in a way that was difficult to name. Relief, exactly. More like the moment before something you've been building toward actually begins. She came over. He stood not because he was performing courtesy, but because it was what he did. They shook hands, which was slightly strange given the history, and sat down. The waitress came. Vivienne ordered coffee, black, and looked briefly at the menu, and then set it aside. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," she said. "You asked directly," he said. "I think that deserved a direct response." She looked at him. She had the particular quality of someone who had prepared for multiple versions of this conversation and was trying to determine which one she was in. "I want to say this without the language I usually use," she said. "Professional framing. I've been thinking about what to say for a while, and I've drafted a version that sounds like something from a corporate communication, and I don't want to give you that." "Okay," he said. She looked at her coffee for a moment. "What I said to you in that conference room about your daughter, about your financial situation. I said it because I believed it would work." She looked up. "I thought that if I made you afraid enough about what you'd lose, you'd back down. And I was wrong about what mattered to you. But I was also, even if it had worked, it would have been a wrong thing to do." She paused. "I used your responsibility to your daughter as a weapon. I knew what I was doing when I did it, and I want you to know that I know that." The coffee shop was doing its normal Saturday morning business. Around them, quiet conversations, the sound of the espresso machine, someone's kid at the counter, asking about the pastry options with great seriousness. Caleb looked at his cup. "I knew what you were doing when you did it," he said. "Wasn't the hardest part." What was the hardest part? He thought about it honestly. Not what would sound right, what was actually true. The hardest part was the 14 people in that room, he said. All of them watching, and the decision I had to make about what I was going to do in front of them. Because Lily watches me. Maybe not literally, she wasn't there, but she's watching. Everything I do in those moments is part of what she's learning about how a person handles being pushed. Vivienne was looking at him with complete attention. The executive attention she deployed in boardrooms, something less managed than that. "If I'd stayed," he said. "If I'd let you use her against me and stayed and approved that launch, what would I have taught her? That fear is a good enough reason to do something you know is wrong. That stability is worth surrendering your judgment." He shook his head slightly. "That's not a lesson I want inside her." "I understand that now," Vivienne said. "I didn't then. I thought—" She stopped, started again. "I thought people's limits were mostly financial. That if the number was right and the threat was real enough, almost anyone would make the practical choice. Some people would have," he said. "Most people would have," she said. "Which is why I thought it would work." A pause. "You weren't calculating the same thing I was calculating," he said. "What were you calculating?" He looked at her. "Whether I could look at my own kid and not feel ashamed," he said. "That's the only calculation I was running." The table was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, Blackridge was doing what it did on a November Saturday, unhurried. The mountains behind everything. The kind of morning that asked nothing of you. Vivienne said, "I've been reading the original documentation. Your reports, your analyses. The ones that went through Preston's office and came out the other side as something else." She paused. "I've been reading them as what they actually are. Your work. How is it?" Not sardonically. Genuinely curious. "It's very good," she said. "It's precise. You have a way of describing the failure point of a system that makes it visible even to someone who isn't an engineer." She looked slightly uncomfortable saying this, as though acknowledging it was something she'd owed for a long time, and the owing of it was not entirely comfortable. I should have been reading these years ago, instead of having them translated for me by someone who was making himself the author of them. Wasn't entirely your fault, Caleb said. She looked at him. Preston was good at what he did, he said. He was genuinely skilled at presenting things. If you didn't have a reason to trace the documentation back to its source, you wouldn't. He paused. You also didn't ask. When something worked, you took the explanation you were given. Yes, she said, I did. That's the thing I'd want you to actually change, he said. Not just for me, for the people who come after me in your company. The engineers who are going to find problems and need someone above them to actually hear the problem, and not just the summary of the problem. Gabriel's review, she said. The documentation audit we're running on existing installations. I heard about it. She looked slightly surprised. Priya keeps me informed, he said. Not improperly. She knows things. He almost smiled. She's always known things. Vivian made a sound that was almost a laugh. Not quite, but close. Yes, I'm starting to realize that. The audit is the right move, he said. The twice-weekly technical sessions with Gabriel. Those are the right moves. He picked up his coffee cup. I'm not going to tell you they fix what happened, but they're the right direction. Is there anything I could do that would fix what happened? She asked. He thought about it. Actually thought about it. Not reflexively. He said, what happened happened. Preston stole 4 years of work. You made a management culture where that was possible and then used my daughter to try to keep me in line. He set the cup down. Those things are true and they'll keep being true, regardless of what comes next. What comes next is just what comes next. She nodded. Something in her face was doing something complicated that she wasn't quite concealing. Vivian Marlowe, he thought, had spent a long time being very good at concealing things, and that skill was slightly less reliable than it used to be. If that was good or bad for her, but it was interesting. I want to ask you something, she said, and I want you to know that the answer doesn't affect anything, no contracts, no professional relationship, nothing. I'm asking because I want to know. Ask, he said. Would you come back to Sterling Vector? The coffee shop moved around them. Someone at the counter laughed at something. Caleb looked at her. He said, because of what happened. Partly, he said, but that's not the main reason. What's the main reason? He thought about how to say it accurately. At Frontier Core, the work I do has my name on it, he said. Just formally, actually. When I raise a concern, it's reviewed. When I solve a problem, it's recorded as my solution. When I make a recommendation, Marcus listens to it and either acts on it or tells me directly why he's not. He paused. I've had a standard named after me. Not officially named, it's called the Technical Integrity Standard, which is fine. I don't need my name on the document. It exists because I said it needed to exist, and someone with the authority to make it happen agreed. He looked at her steadily. I couldn't have built that at Sterling Vector. Not because of you specifically, though that's part of it. Because of what Sterling Vector is. It was built on a certain kind of culture, and cultures don't change because someone decides they should. They change slowly, with a lot of failure in between. She said, you're doing the right things, he said. I'm not dismissing that, but it's going to take years. I have work to do that I can do now, where I am. She was quiet for a moment. That's a fair answer. You asked for an honest one, I did. She looked at her coffee cup. Can I ask one more thing? Go ahead. Are you happy? She said it without the professional coding. Just the question, flat and direct. He thought about Saturday mornings, and balsa wood structures, and garden beds, and the Mercy Regional Relay schematic, and the engineers on his floor who brought him problems because they trusted the conversation that would follow. He said actually happy. Which I know sounds like, but it's true. The work matters and the schedule lets me be home, and the decisions I make are mine. He paused. That's most of what I needed. I didn't know how clearly I needed it until it was gone for a minute. She looked at him for a long moment. I believed, she said, that what made people valuable was what a company could give them. Salary, stability, platform. She stopped. I think I've been running a company on that belief for 5 years. Rewarding the people who performed the role I gave them and being genuinely surprised, multiple times, when the person who was actually doing the work turned out to not be the person who was performing the role. It's a common mistake, he said. It's an expensive one, she said. Yes, he agreed. It is. They sat with that for a moment. He finished his coffee. She finished hers. Outside, someone was trying to parallel park a large truck in a space that was not quite large enough, and doing it with the patient determination of someone who had decided it was going to work. I should let you get to your Saturday, Vivian said. She straightened slightly, the way she did when she was concluding something. I've got time, he said, but yeah. They stood. She reached out her hand. Something intervened. He shook it the same way they'd greeted each other, which now felt like something slightly different, but still the right gesture for two people who respected each other in a complicated way. Thank you for meeting me, she said. Thank you for asking directly, he said. And for coming alone. No. She nodded. Then she did something yet. She looked at him without the professional surface, just for a second, in the way people look when they're not managing the impression they're making. I'm sorry, she said, for what I said in that room, for using your daughter. I am actually sorry. He looked at her. He said, I could tell. She left. He sat back down, ordered another coffee. Because he had nowhere, he needed to be for 40 minutes, and the book was still on the table, and he sat in the morning light of Carmichael's and thought about the conversation. About what was in it and what wasn't. And what you did with an apology that was genuine and came from someone who had done a genuine wrong, and whether those two facts could exist in the same place without one canceling the other out. He decided they could. They just sat differently than either of them did alone. 3 weeks later, on a Saturday afternoon in early December, Lily finished the bookshelf. It had been a project she'd started in October, partially inspired by the balsa wood structural model, partially because she'd decided she needed more shelf space, and had announced with complete confidence that she was going to build it herself. Caleb had helped her measure and had shown her the joint technique twice, and had then, deliberately, gotten out of the way. She'd worked on it in the garage on weekend afternoons, with a stubbornness that he recognized from somewhere, and tried not to look too pleased about. The finished product was sitting in the middle of the garage floor when he came in from the backyard, pistons slightly lopsided on the left side, one shelf approximately 4 millimeters lower than it should be. The paint she'd chosen, a dark blue that was not quite the shade she'd planned, applied, with the enthusiastic imprecision of someone who is painting, rather than performing the act of paint, real and slightly wrong, in the way that things made by hand, by someone learning, are always slightly wrong. Yes, he steamed. Lily was standing next to it with her arms crossed, looking at it with the critical assessment of a person who knew what she'd been going for and was calibrating the distance between his intention and result. Caleb stood next to her and looked at it. Well, he said. The left his side, she said. I see it. The third shelf, she said. 4 millimeters, maybe. She uncrossed her arms. Is it bad? He looked at it honestly, at the joints, which were good, better than he'd expected, genuinely better than her age would suggest as typical, at the overall structure, which was sound, at the thing as a whole, which was a bookshelf that a 10-year-old had designed and built with her own hands over 2 months of weekend afternoons. It's good, he said. She shook her head, the way she did when she wasn't satisfied, with an answer that was true but incomplete. It's better than good, she said. It's right. He looked at her. The joints are right, she said. The load distribution is right. The left side is off, but the structure is sound. It'll hold weight. She paused. What I got wrong. I also know what I got right. Both things are true. He looked at the bookshelf, then at his daughter. She was 10 years old. She had blue paint on her left forearm and sawdust on her jacket, and the particular expression of someone who has completed something real and is conducting an honest assessment of it, seeking reassurance, not performing modesty, just being accurate. Yeah, he said, it's right. She looked at him, checked his face for the thing she was checking for, which was whether he meant it. Okay, she said. Help me carry it upstairs. They carried the bookshelf upstairs. Together, it was heavier than it looked, which meant the wood's selection had been sound, and put it in her room against the wall she designated for it. She loaded 3 books onto it immediately, testing the weight with the unsentimental thoroughness of someone conducting a functional review. The shelf held. She stepped back, looked at it in place, in the room, doing the thing it was built to do. Good, she said, and went to wash the paint off her arm. Caleb stood in her room for a moment, looking at the bookshelf against the wall, slightly lopsided, joints well made, holding 3 books without difficulty. Through the window, the December light was doing what it did in Colorado in early winter, thin and clear and honest about what it was. He thought about Vivian's question in Carmichael's, about whether he was happy. He thought about the question the same way he thought about most things practically, in terms of what was actually true rather than what he might want to be true. What was actually true was that he was standing in his daughter's room, looking at a bookshelf she had built herself, in a house he'd paid for with work he could put his name on, with a job that let him be here on Saturday afternoons when things like bookshelves got finished. It was not a perfect life. The mortgage was real. The gray at his temples was real. The 4 years of stolen credit were real, and the fact that they'd been partially documented and addressed didn't make them unstolen. His wife was still gone in the way that she'd always now be gone, which was a weight that didn't disappear so much as become familiar. None of it was resolved cleanly. Real things rarely were. But when he thought about the man who had sat in a conference room 4 months ago and set a badge on a table because there was simply no version of himself that could do otherwise, he didn't feel regret. He didn't feel like that man had been reckless or naive or insufficiently practical. He felt like that man had known something important about who he was and had not pretended otherwise, even when pretending would have been easier and the room was full of people watching. It wasn't nothing at all. He turned the light off in Lily's room and went downstairs to start dinner. The house was warm and slightly cluttered in the way houses with children in them are. Somewhere in the Hargrove Tower on the 48th floor of downtown Blackridge, Vivian Marlowe was probably reading an engineering report and asking questions she hadn't known to ask 5 months ago. And at Frontier Core, on the engineering floor, a relay synchronization standard with Caleb's fingerprints all over it was protecting hospital infrastructure that most people never thought about unless it failed. It wasn't going to fail, not on his watch. The Mercy Regional installation took 11 weeks because of incompetence, because Caleb had insisted on the extended testing window, and the extended testing window turned out to be justified. 3 weeks into the implementation, Theo found a legacy interface conflict buried in the hospital's original 1990s grid documentation that nobody had flagged in 2 decades of service records, because nobody had looked at the 1990s documentation in 2 decades. It was exactly the kind of thing that didn't announce itself. It hid in the places where old systems met new ones, where the assumption was that if it had always worked, it must have been working correctly. Caleb spent 4 hours on a Tuesday with Theo and a facilities engineer named Raymond, who had been at Mercy Regional for 31 years and who knew the hospital's electrical infrastructure the way some people knew their childhood homes. Intuitively, personally, with the specific knowledge that comes from having fixed the same problems enough time to understand their personalities. This section, Raymond said, pointing at a diagram spread across the facility's office table. He was a heavy-set man in his 60s, wore reading glasses pushed up on his forehead when he wasn't using them, and had the deliberate manner of someone who had learned not to hurry, because hurrying in his work created consequences that lasted. This has been a workaround since '94. The original contractor retired, and nobody who came after touched it because it worked. It worked with the old relay configuration, Caleb said. Under the new system, the load pathway is different. Under certain blackout conditions, the workaround becomes the problem. Raymond looked at the diagram for a long time. How do we fix it, he said. We replace the interface, Caleb said. Not the whole section, the interface specifically. It's a 4-hour job if we schedule it during a low-demand period. Raymond pushed his glasses down and looked at the diagram through them. Back up at Caleb. You found this. Because you read the 1990 documentation. My engineer found it, Caleb said. Because I told him to read documentation that predated our standard review window. Raymond looked at Theo, who was sitting across the table with a laptop, and the expression of someone trying to appear modest about something he was actually fairly pleased about. Good catch, Raymond said. Thank you, Theo said. When do you want to schedule the interface replacement? Raymond asked. Your call, Caleb said. You know this facility better than I do. Tell me the lowest demand window, and we'll be here. Raymond thought about it. Tuesday nights, 2 to 6 a.m. Patient activity, fewest active systems. Next Tuesday, Caleb said. We'll be here at 1:50. They were there at 1:50. The interface replacement took 3 hours and 40 minutes. Caleb stayed the entire time, which Raymond noticed, and which established between them the particular understanding that exists between people who both take the same things seriously. When the new interface was tested and confirmed, Raymond walked Caleb to the parking structure at 5:40 in the morning. The sky was the particular dark blue that comes just before dawn in winter, and the parking structure was cold and mostly empty. I've been in this hospital for 31 years, Raymond said. I've had about 15 infrastructure companies come through here. You're the third person in 31 years who stayed for the overnight job. Who were the other two? Caleb asked. One retired. One died. Raymond paused. Good men. Caleb looked at the dark blue sky above the parking structure. Good company, he said. Raymond almost smiled. Drive safe, he said. The full Frontier Core expansion, all 3 hospital systems, was completed and independently certified by March. The certification process was the one Caleb had designed, an outside engineering firm, unaffiliated with Frontier Core or the hospital networks, running the full relay synchronization test under simulated blackout conditions for each installation. A sample. Every installation. The kind of review that cost more and took longer, and produced a document that meant something because of what it required rather than what it concluded. Every installation passed. Marcus sent Caleb a brief email when the 3rd certification came in. It read, "Good work. Now let's talk about the Eastern expansion," which was how Marcus communicated satisfaction not with ceremony, but by immediately moving to the next his thing. The Eastern expansion conversation happened in Marcus's office on a Thursday morning, and it was a longer and more complex conversation than the hospital network contracts had been, because it involved a different category of infrastructure regional grid interconnects that touched not just hospitals, but municipal water treatment, emergency communications, and the kind of backbone systems that most people never thought about until they failed. The scale was different. The responsibility was different. The technical challenges were different in ways that Caleb found, sitting across from Marcus with a cup of coffee and a preliminary assessment document, genuinely interesting. This is bigger than what we've been doing, Caleb said. Yes, Marcus said. My team needs to grow. Not just Theo and the current senior engineers. We need people who specialize in municipal grid interfaces, specifically. That's a narrow skill set, and good people with it are not easy to find. How many? 3, minimum. 4 is better. And I want to be involved in the hiring. You are involved in the hiring, Marcus said. I assumed that. I'm saying I want to be in the actual interviews. Reviewing resumes after someone else has filtered them. Marcus looked at him. Is this about what happened at your last job? Caleb thought about Preston Hale and about a decade of talent that had moved through Sterling Vector's hiring processes, filtered by someone whose primary criterion for evaluation was whether the person in question would be easy to take credit from. Partly, he said. Mostly it's about the fact that the person who understands what we actually need on the technical side should be in the room when we're deciding who to bring in. Agreed, Marcus said. They talked for another hour. By the time Caleb left, the Eastern expansion had a preliminary timeline, a staffing plan, and a budget framework that was ambitious but not unrealistic. He walked back to the engineering floor and spent the afternoon on the documentation review for the Versailles installation. The 3rd hospital network, which had the cleanest implementation of the 3 and which he was using as the model template for the Eastern expansion systems. Theo knocked on his open office door at 4:30. You have a minute? Come in. Theo sat down. He had the expression of someone who had something specific to say and had been thinking about how to say it. He was 26, which meant he was still in the period of figuring out how to separate his own instincts from the second guessing of those instincts, and he had good instincts, but wasn't always sure yet whether to trust them. The Eastern expansion documentation, Theo said. I've been looking at the municipal grid interface specs. I'm going to need you heavily involved in that project. I want to flag something, Theo said. Before we get into the hiring and the timeline, go ahead. The interface protocol we're planning to use the one from the Riverside template. It's the right call for the hospital installations. But for municipal water treatment interfaces, specifically, there's a newer synchronization standard that was published by the IEEE in January. I read it last week. He paused. I think if we build the Eastern expansion on the older protocol, we're going to need a revision cycle in about 3 years when the municipal systems update to the new standard. Whereas if we build on the January standard now, we absorb a higher implementation cost upfront but avoid the revision cycle, Caleb said. And the revision cycle on municipal grid systems is not cheap, Theo said. And not fast. Caleb looked at him. Did you read the full standard or the summary? The full standard. When? Last week and this morning. Caleb was quiet for a moment. He thought about a conference room 4 months ago in which he had brought information that nobody wanted to sit with and about what it had cost to bring it and what it would have cost not to. He thought about a policy he'd written any engineer, any level, documented concern, independent review. Write it up, he said. Full analysis. Cost comparison between the two protocols over a 10-year horizon. I want the implementation cost, the revision cycle cost under the old standard, and your recommendation. Theo looked slightly surprised, as though he'd expected more friction. You want the recommendation, he said. You've read the full standard, and I haven't yet, Caleb said. You have more information than I do right now. Give me your recommendation, and I'll read the standard and we'll discuss it. Theo nodded, stood up. One more thing, Caleb said. Theo paused. This what you just did. Coming in here with a flag before the project is locked. That's the job. That's the important part. Not the implementation, not the certification. He paused. Don't stop doing this. Theo looked at him for a moment. Okay, he said, in the tone of someone who understood that more was being communicated than the words themselves. He left. Caleb turned back to his documentation and made a note to read the IEEE January standard that evening. He read it that evening, after Lily went to bed, at the kitchen table where he had once sat at 11:30 at night going through fault simulation results that nobody at Sterling Vector wanted to hear. The house was quiet. The table had the same coffee stain in the corner that he kept meaning to address. The kitchen window reflected the room back at him, dark outside, and he sat in his own kitchen reading a technical standard because a 26-year-old engineer on his team had read it first and brought it to him. The recognition that this was the system working correctly was not dramatic, but it was real and it was his. Theo's written analysis came in 2 days later. His recommendation was the January standard. His cost comparison was thorough and his methodology was sound. Caleb reviewed it, added 3 questions in the margin, and sent it back with a note. Good analysis. See questions. Let's talk Friday. On Friday, they talked for an hour. Caleb asked the 3 questions. Theo answered 2 of them well, and admitted he wasn't sure about the third, which was the right answer because the third question was legitimately uncertain, and pretending otherwise would have been a problem. They identified what additional information they needed and agreed on how to get it. By the end of the conversation, the Eastern Expansion Protocol decision was grounded in something real, rather than something assumed. Caleb sent Marcus a brief update that afternoon. Marcus replied, "Makes sense," with what the analysis supports. That was the whole exchange. Second-guessing, no politics, no filtering, 3 layers to determine whether the decision was strategically aligned with current executive priorities. Just here's what the analysis supports, and do what the analysis supports. It was such a simple thing. It was such an enormous thing. Sterling Vector's transformation, meanwhile, was proceeding in the slow and uneven way that institutional change always did 2 steps in the right direction and 1 step sideways. Week of visible progress, followed by a meeting where the old habits resurfaced and someone's had to correct the course again. Gabriel's documentation audit had found 4 installation sites with legacy interface gaps similar to the Mercy Regional issue, not as severe but present. He'd intervened. Vivian had authorized the corrective work without hesitation, which had surprised the engineering team less than it would have 6 months ago, and more than they wanted to admit. She attended 2 of the 4 correction reviews in person, which was the kind of thing nobody had expected from her, and which communicated something that a memo could not have. The record correction process, formally attributing the technical analyses and solution frameworks to Caleb's original authorship, had taken 2 months to complete and had required its own specialized documentation process that Rachel Osei managed with the thoroughness she applied to everything. The revised records didn't undo what Preston had done. They created an accurate archive. There was a distinction between those two things, and Vivian understood it, which was the point. Preston's termination had been finalized in December. Yes, he'd intervened. The board's investigation had concluded that his conduct constituted fraud under his employment agreement, the systematic misrepresentation of work product authorship, the deliberate suppression of a subordinate's advancement for personal benefit. He retained his severance because the legal standard for clawing it back was narrow, and the legal cost of pursuing it was not justified. This was the kind of outcome that was legally correct and humanly unsatisfying, which was also the case with many outcomes. Priya had been promoted to senior technical director, which was the position that had been blocked for Caleb, and which she filled with the particular combination of technical rigor and direct communication that made her excellent at it. On her first day in the role, she sent Caleb a text message that said, "I finally have an office. It smells like Preston's cologne. I'm buying a plant." He texted back, "Get a big one." She did. She sent him a photo of an aggressively large rubber plant occupying approximately 40% of the former Preston Hale office. He looked at it for a moment and felt something that was not quite satisfaction, but lived in that neighborhood. Vivian's relationship with her engineering team had changed in a way that was difficult to quantify, but that everyone on that floor felt. She still moved fast. She was still impatient with things she considered unnecessary. She was still wrong sometimes, and she still occasionally had to be redirected by people who understood the technical reality better than she did. He'd intervened. She was not, and would probably never be, a different person than the one who had spent 5 years running a company on the assumption that talent was something you managed rather than something you listened to. But she was different in the specific way that people become different when something has cracked the certainty they built their professional identity on. She asked more questions. She sat in more technical meetings. She was to dismiss concerns she didn't immediately understand, which is a different skill than understanding the concerns and a harder one to develop when you've spent years not needing it. It was imperfect change, incomplete and slow and not without backsliding. But it was real, and real was worth something. In April, Lily's junior engineering showcase was held at her school on a Friday evening. The gymnasium had been organized into rows of folding tables, with projects on them, small structures, simple machines, one elaborate display involving a miniature water wheel that had been clearly built with significant parental involvement, and which Lily assessed with the unsentimental eye of a judge examining evidence. Her bookshelf entry was disqualified from the structural category, as it turned out, because the showcase rules specified models rather than functional objects. She had not read the rules carefully before entering. This was a lesson she took with visible irritation, and what Caleb privately was a useful amount of embarrassment, the kind that teaches rather than scars. She pivoted, with 2 weeks remaining before the showcase, to building a scale model of a bridge using the same jointing technique she'd developed for the bookshelf. The model was smaller, sloppier in places than the bookshelf had been, and structurally sound in the specific way that meant it held the weight the judges placed on it, and the joints did not fail. She placed second. Coming out of the gymnasium afterward, she walked beside him with her certificate rolled up in her hand and the expression of someone conducting an honest accounting. "Second," she said. "Strong field," he said. "The water wheel was first," she said. "The kid's dad is a mechanical engineer. I noticed the construction quality. It wasn't fair," she said, then paused. "Well, it was fair. It was just the advantages weren't equal." He looked at her. She was 11 now, had turned 11 in February, and was in the particular period of figuring out the difference between what was unfair and what was simply uneven, which was a distinction that took most considerably longer to locate. "Sometimes the advantages aren't equal," he said. "That doesn't mean second isn't real." She said, "I'm not saying it isn't real." She looked at the certificate. "I'm saying next year, I'm going to read the rules first and build something that can actually compete in the right category." He was quiet for a moment. That's the right answer, he said. She looked up at him. I know. They walked to the car. She climbed in the back seat, which she still preferred for reasons she hadn't explained and he hadn't interrogated, and rolled the certificate tightly and held it while he drove. Yeah, are you actually happy at Frontier Corps? Like not just okay, actually happy. He glanced at her in the rearview mirror. She was looking out the window at the evening streets of Blackridge moving past, the particular expression she wore, when she was asking something she'd been thinking about for a while. He thought about it the way she deserved, actually, not reflexively. He thought about Theo bringing him a technical flag because the system said he should, and the flag turning out to matter. He thought about Raymond at Mercy Regional and a parking structure at 5:40 in the morning and a sky going from dark blue to something lighter. He thought about 11 weeks of careful work and 3 certifications and a policy that existed didn't exist, because he'd said it needed to exist, and someone with authority had agreed. He thought about Marcus replying to emails as if 4 words would and meaning every one of them. He thought about Lily's bookshelf in her room, slightly lopsided, holding weight. He said, actually happy. She nodded at the window, as though this confirmed something she'd been tracking. Yet, I'm glad you quit, she said. He didn't answer immediately. Let it sit in the car with them. For a moment, the weight of it, the truth of it, the particular thing it meant coming from her. So am I, kid, he said. She didn't say anything else. He drove them home through the April evening, Blackridge moving around them, the mountains doing what they always did at this hour, holding the light longer than everything below them, stubbornly lit while the valley went dark. Yes, there is something that Caleb Hartman would not have said. At the time, he was not someone who narrated his own life while he was living it, but that was nonetheless true throughout all of it. From the conference room to the storm to the breakfast, with Marcus to the coffee, with Vivienne to the overnight job at Mercy Regional to the April evening driving home with the second-place certificate in the back seat. So the thing is this. We spend a considerable amount of our lives believing that the institutions we belong to are the source of our value. The company, the title, the salary, the performance review, the org chart position, these things tell us where we stand. And for a long time, if we're not careful, we start to believe that where we stand is who we are, that the job creates the worth rather than housing it. Yes, Caleb had believed something close to this, in the quiet way people believe things they've never been forced to examine. He'd been reliable and competent and careful for 7 years and had trusted that those qualities were recognized and rewarded by the institution around him. And when the institution had failed at that recognition, spectacularly, dishonestly, with a specific human agent doing specific damage over specific years, he had come close to accepting the institution's verdict. He was nothing, except he wasn't. He never had been. The proof was not in the Frontier Corps contracts or the 220 or the consortium decision or Marcus's forward emails. The proof was in the thing that didn't change when the badge left his pocket. He still knew what a relay synchronization defect looked like. He still knew how to read 1990s grid documentation and understand what the workarounds meant. He still knew how to sit in a room seat with people who were afraid to tell the truth and make the truth feel safe enough to say. He still knew how to drive through the night when something failed and a hospital needed someone who understood it. Those things were his. They had always been his. The company had given him a context in which to use them, and a paycheck in exchange for using them, but it had not given him the things themselves. He'd brought those through the door on his first day, and he'd walked out with them on the day he resigned, and nobody had been able to touch them in between, no matter how systematically they'd tried. This is not a simple lesson. It is not the kind of thing you learn once and have permanently. Caleb did not wake up every morning feeling the full settled weight of his own worth. He woke up most thinking about the day's problems, and whether he had time for coffee before the first call, and whether Lily had packed her lunch or left it on the counter again. He had days when the old exhaustion resurfaced. He had days when he wondered whether the path he'd chosen had cost more than he'd admitted to himself. But he also had the technical integrity standard in a company that had adopted it for real, not for show. He had 3 hospitals where the emergency relay systems were tested and certified and documented with his name actually on them. He had a daughter who was learning not from what he told her, but from what she watched him do. That character was not something a company could give you or take away. That last thing was the one that actually mattered to him. The contracts. Not the title. Not the vindication. Those were real, but they were contingent. They could have gone differently. The consortium could have ruled another way. Frontier Corps could have been a different company than it was. Contingent things are not foundations. What Lily was learning was a foundation. She was learning that a person with legitimate expertise and genuine integrity, confronted with the choice between fear and honesty, could choose honesty and survive it. Not comfortably, it had not been comfortable, and she had watched enough of it to know. But survivably, with the mortgage still paid, and the work still good, and the name still meaning something. Deep he doomed. She was learning that the people who tell you that you're nothing are usually doing it, because they're afraid of what you'd be if you understood your own value. The weapon of financial fear is real but not ultimate. That you can carry the weight of responsibility for another person, a child, a family, someone who depends on you without surrendering the judgment that makes you worth depending on. These were not lessons Caleb had written down or taught directly. He was not that kind of father, not the kind who delivered speeches or drew explicit moral conclusions from events. He was the kind who drove through the night and read the 1990s documentation, and stayed for the overnight job, and came home in time for dinner when he could. Lily extracted her own conclusions from watching him. She always had. The bookshelf in her room was slightly lopsided and structurally sound, and she had built it herself. Exactly which parts were right and which parts she'd gotten wrong, and she held both pieces of that knowledge without letting one erase the other. He thought that was about the best he could have taught her. On a Thursday evening in May, 6 months after the consortium decision, Caleb was driving home from Frontier Corps when his phone connected to the car speakers with an incoming call. "Checking in," she said. "I figured. How's the Eastern expansion?" "Complicated. Good. We hired 2 of the 3 municipal grid specialists. The 3rd candidate is coming in next week." "Theo working out?" "He flagged a protocol issue that saved us a significant revision cycle," Caleb said. "He's good. He's going to be excellent." "And the bookshelf?" Karen asked. She'd seen the photo he'd sent in December. "Still holding weight," he said. She added 2 more shelves. She built 2 more shelves on top of the original structure, modified the joint design based on the original tolerances. He paused. "The new shelves are better than the first one." Karen was quiet for a moment. She's herself," he said. "Okay. She's also you." He drove through the May evening, the mountains ahead of him catching the last of the light, the city of Blackridge, doing its ordinary evening thing below and around him. He'd lived here for 12 years. He knew the particular way the light left these mountains, and the particular sound the storm made when it came off the Rockies, and the way the air smelled in May, when the snow was off the lower elevations but still on the peaks. He knew where he was. "Karen," he said. "Yeah, I'm good," he said. "Actually good. Not performing it." "I know," she said. "I can hear it." They talked for another few minutes, her kids, a family thing in the summer, something about a trip she was planning. Normal things. The kind of call that need to carry much because the main thing has already been established. He pulled into his street. The house was lit up. Lily had forgotten to turn off the porch light again, which she always forgot when she came home first, which he had stopped reminding her about because it was a small thing, and they were running low on energy for small things. He parked, sat for a moment in the quiet of the car. Porch light was on. Lily was home. The Eastern expansion had 2 good engineers, and a 3rd coming next week, and a protocol decision that was grounded in sound analysis. The hospitals had certified infrastructure. The policy was real and functioning. He was, in the most ordinary and complete sense of the word, exactly where he had chosen to be. He got out of the car, walked up the front path. The porch boards he'd been meaning to replace for 2 years made the same familiar sound under his feet, that slight give, that creak, that was not yet a problem, but would need attention before winter. He'd do it this weekend. He had the boards already. He'd bought them in March, and they were in the garage. And Saturday morning, he had nothing scheduled before 9. He unlocked the door. "Dad?" Lily called from somewhere upstairs. "Kitchen," he called back. He hung his jacket, went to the kitchen, started dinner. Lily appeared in the doorway 8 minutes later with textbooks and the blue pen she always had and sawdust on her sleeve, which meant she'd been in the garage working on something, which was its own information. "What are you building?" he asked. "Scale model," she said. "For next year's showcase." She dropped into a chair. "I read the rules this time." "Good, it's a bridge. Different design than the last one." She opened a textbook that appeared to be math. "I found a load distribution method I want to try." "Where'd you find it?" "IEEE journal," she said without looking up, as though this were unremarkable. He looked at his daughter sitting at his kitchen table doing math homeworks with sawdust on her sleeve, reading IEEE journals for bridge models. "Source," he said. "I know," she said. He turned back to the stove. Outside, May Evening in Blackridge was doing exactly what May Evening in Blackridge did, the light going slow, the mountains holding it, the ordinary machinery of a day completing itself without ceremony. The porch light was on. The kitchen was warm. A 10-year-old 11, he corrected himself. She was 11, now was at the table reading engineering journals, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Which in this house it was. The job had never made Caleb Hartman valuable. He had been making the job valuable all along. And now, standing in his own kitchen on a Thursday evening in May, with dinner on the stove and sawdust on his daughter's sleeve and the porch boards that needed fixings on Saturday, and the eastern expansion moving forward and the hospitals running clean, he understood something that he had always known but had never had such clear evidence for. A company can give you a paycheck and a title and a performance review and an org chart position. It can take those things back. It can tell you that without those things, you are nothing. What it cannot do, what no institution has ever been able to do, to any person who understood this clearly enough, is reach inside you and take the thing that was never theirs to give. The character was his. The judgment was his. The courage to walk out of a room when the room was asking him to be less than what he was that had always been his. He'd been carrying it through every door he'd ever walked through. He was going to keep carrying it. That was enough. That was, it turned out, more than enough.